At 40 below, the snow does not lie. The cold turns it to something like wet plaster, and it takes a perfect cast of everything that crosses it, every vole, every fox, every caribou, and it holds that cast like poured stone until the spring thaw breaks it. A man who can read snow can read the whole night written out on the ground in the morning, every visitor, every kill, everything that came near his door, and stood and thought about it and moved on. So when I tell you that something walked a slow circle all the way around my cabin in the night, on two legs, in prints I could have dropped both my fists into, I am not telling you a feeling I had in the gloom. I am telling you what the snow showed me at first light, plain as ink on a page, and I am telling you that the circle had no beginning and no end. It did not come from the trees. It did not go back to them. It was simply there, all the way around the cabin, as if the thing that made it had started in the air and finished in the air, and in between had walked one full ring around the four walls I was sleeping inside of. I am a backcountry ranger in the Brooks Range, in Arctic Alaska, the most remote country left under the flag. This is what happened the autumn I went north to check on an old man who had stopped answering his radio, and learned why some of the men who winter out here do not all come back. Let me square away the small business quick, the way you do before the weather closes a window, because there is weather in this one and the window does not stay open long. If you want to be along for the next run, subscribe to the channel and switch that notification bell on so you are in the plane with me the next time I fly out toward something I should probably have left alone, and press the like button while it is on your mind. It is nothing to you, and it is a great deal to a story like this, which only reaches the right ears when enough of you give it that small shove. Then do me a kindness down in the comments. Put down where you are tonight, the town and the country, and the time showing on your clock as you listen. I like knowing how far north and south and across the world a single story travels in one night, and how many of us are awake out here in the quiet together. And I will not insult either of us by pretending. I have been at this long enough to know your thumb has not gone anywhere near that like button yet. So here is the whole of it. Press it now, while we are still on the gravel strip with the engine warm, and I give you my word I will not raise it again once we are in the air. Go on. Press it. Good. Let us get loaded and fly. The first thing you have to understand is the size of the country, because the size of it is the whole reason a thing like this can be true and still stay hidden. The Brooks Range is the northernmost mountain range in this nation, a wall of bare gray peaks that runs east to west across the top of Alaska, above the Arctic Circle, dividing the boreal forest of the interior from the great empty tundra of the North Slope that runs on to the frozen ocean. Most of it lies inside a national park called Gates of the Arctic, and that park is the size of a small country, and it has no roads, none, no roads in, no roads through, no maintained trails, no signs, no campgrounds, no cell towers, nothing. You get in by bush plane or by boat or by walking, and once you are in, you are as alone as a person can be on the surface of this earth. There are valleys in that range that no human being has ever set foot in. I believe that with my whole heart, and after the autumn I am going to tell you about, I am glad of it, because I think some of those valleys are not empty, and I think it is better that we have never gone to look. My name is Hollis. I have worked the Arctic backcountry for 9 years, which is a long time for that work, because most people do not last. The cold breaks them, or the dark of the long winter breaks them, or the loneliness does, and they go back south within a season or two. It did not break me. I came north because the South had nothing left for me that I wanted, the details of which I will keep, and I found that the bigger and emptier and colder the country got, the quieter the thing inside me got, until up here, in the biggest, emptiest, coldest country there is, it finally went silent altogether, and I could breathe. Some men need people. I needed the opposite of people, and the Brooks Range is the most of that you can get. The work in a place with no roads and no trails is mostly about the few people who do come, and the few who live out there year-round. In the short summer there are float trips, hunters, the rare hardy backpacker, and we keep what track of them we can. But my district had a handful of permanent residents too, subsistence trappers and old sourdoughs who lived the old way at cabins scattered across hundreds of miles of country. Men who had been out there longer than the park had existed and had a legal right to stay, and who wintered alone in the deep cold with a wood stove and a rifle and a radio, and a big part of my job was keeping a loose watch on them, especially through the freeze-up in the winter. Because out there a broken leg or a failed stove is a death sentence, and the only thread between those men and the rest of the living world was a scheduled radio call once a week to the dispatch office in the village. The village at the south edge of my district was a small Gwich'in community. A few hundred people, Athabascan people whose families have lived in and around that range for thousands of years, who know that country in a way I will never know it no matter how many years I put in. I flew in and out of there, kept my gear there, knew the people a little. And there was an old man there, an elder named Joe Tritt, who I had come to respect more than almost anyone. A quiet, dignified man who had trapped and hunted that range his whole life, and who, when he spoke, said exactly as much as he meant, and not one word more. I mention him now because of one thing he said to me, later, and because the way the village people felt about certain country up in that range is part of this, and I did not understand it until it was nearly too late. In the last part of September, with the freeze-up coming on and the first real snow already down in the high country and the daylight shrinking fast toward the long winter, an old trapper named Amos Tiller missed his radio call. Amos was one of mine. He was somewhere past 70, and he had wintered alone for 40 years at a cabin far up a side drainage in the heart of the range, about as deep into that empty country as any person lived, a place you could only reach by landing a ski or tundra-tired plane on a gravel bar in the river, and then making your way up the valley on foot. He was a hard, capable, solitary old man, and he had never once in all those years missed a radio call, because he knew as well as anyone what missing one meant. When he missed the first one, dispatch was concerned. When he missed the second, a week later, it became my job to fly out and check on him, because a man like Amos Tiller did not miss 2 radio calls unless something had gone very wrong. I chartered the bush pilot I always used, a lean, weathered man named Sigon, who flew a battered little Super Cub on tundra tires and had been landing it on gravel bars and ridgelines in that range for 30 years. Sig was a man of few words and dry ones. He had quit smoking when the doctor told him his heart would not take it, and he chewed nicotine gum without pause, and his one stated goal in life was to get through one more season and then fly south to Arizona to be near his grandchildren, who he spoke of more often than he spoke of anything else. He was the best bush pilot I ever flew with, and the most careful, and that is why what he said when I told him the destination has stayed with me. I told him we were flying up to Amos Tiller's place on the side drainage. Sig stopped chewing for a second. Then he said, "That whole upper valley, the village people will not trap it, you know that. Amos is the only one who ever would, and he is from outside, like you and me." I asked him what he meant. Sig looked at me with his pale, flat pilot's eyes, and he said, "I mean, I have flown this range 30 years, and there is country up there the local folks leave alone, and they have better reasons than I have ever had. And Amos Tiller wintering up that drainage alone all these years always struck me as a man pushing his luck in a place that does not forgive it." And then he started chewing again and went back to loading the plane, and that was all Sigane would say. But he had never said anything like it before, and it sat with me as we took off. The flight up was its own kind of beautiful and lonesome. We flew for over an hour above an emptiness that does not have a bottom to it. Gray peaks and golden tundra going to white at the heights, river valleys winding silver through all of it, and not one road, not one building, not one light, not one mark of a human being for the whole horizon in every direction. The bigness of it pressed on me the way it always did. And as we turned up the side drainage toward Amos Tiller's valley, the country changed in a way I felt before I could name. The peaks closed in, the valley narrowed and deepened, and the autumn color drained out of it, so that the upper valley, where Amos kept his cabin, lay gray and white and still beneath us, the spruce thin and black, the slopes already deep in the early snow. And Sig brought us down low to look for the cabin, and his easy patter went quiet, and he flew that valley with both hands on the stick and his jaw working hard on the gum. Before I take you down onto that gravel bar, where this turns into the longest night of my life, let me ask you the one small thing while we are still up here in the daylight with the engine running steady. If this account has a hold on you, reach out and like this video and subscribe so that the next person who needs to hear something like this can find their way to it. It is the easy thing, the warm, dry, safe thing, done from a place where nothing can reach you. Almost no one in this story did the easy, safe thing while there was still time. You can. We found the cabin. It sat where Amos had built it 40 years before, on a bench above the river, a low sod-roofed log cabin with a cache on stilts beside it, and a meat pole, and the gray remains of a winter's woodpile. And the first wrong thing was the one a bush pilot notices before anything else, and Sig said it out loud as we passed low over the bench. No smoke, no track. In the deep cold of a freeze-up, a living man keeps his stove going day and night, and there should have been a thread of wood smoke from the stovepipe and a packed trail of boot prints in the snow between the cabin and the woodpile and the river. There was nothing. The chimney was cold. The snow around the cabin lay smooth and unbroken, no human track at all, as if Amos Tiller had not walked outside his own door in days. Sig put the plane down on the gravel bar a half-mile downriver, the only flat landing in that whole valley, a hard, short landing on frozen gravel that he greased the way only 30 years can teach a man to. We sat a moment in the sudden silence after the engine died. Then Sig told me a thing I should have weighed more heavily than I did. He said the weather was turning. He said a system was coming down off the slope that was going to drop temperature and snow into that valley within a day, maybe less, and that once it socked in he would not be able to fly back in to get me, not for days, maybe longer. He told me to go up to the cabin, find out what I could find out fast, and be back on that gravel bar in 3 hours, because after that he was flying out with me or without me, and if it was without me I was wintering in until the weather broke. I told him 3 hours would be plenty. I believed it. It was a half-mile to the cabin. How long could it take to check on one old man? I shouldered my pack and my rifle, and I started up the frozen river toward the cabin alone, while Sig stayed with the plane, and the cold pressed down out of a low gray sky, and the valley held a silence so complete that the crunch of my own boots in the snow sounded like a thing I should be ashamed of, too loud, an intrusion, in a place that had gone very still and seemed, the whole way up that river, to be holding its breath and watching me come. I reached the cabin in about 20 minutes, and from the moment I came up onto the bench, I knew that whatever had happened to Amos Tiller had happened outside, in the open and not in his bed. The unbroken snow I had seen from the plane was not quite unbroken once I was standing in it. There was old track, drifted nearly smooth, days old, and reading it was the first piece of the thing. And it is the piece I keep coming back to because I am one of the few people alive who can read snow like that, and I almost wish I could not. Here is what the snow told me. Some days before, Amos Tiller had come out of his cabin in a hurry. I could see it in the gait of the drifted-over prints, long strides, the prints of a man not walking but going somewhere fast, out from the cabin door and across the bench toward the tree line. And I could see what he had been doing, because Amos had been a careful old hand and he had come out with his rifle. I found the one dropped brass casing later, fired once, and his tracks did not stop or fall at the tree line. They went into the spruce, and they did not come back out. 40 years that man had wintered in that valley, and his last act had been to come out of his door fast with his rifle, fire one shot toward the trees, and walk into them, and the snow held no record of him ever walking back. And around his tracks, over them, beside them, were the others. I crouched over them for a long time in the cold, and the longer I looked, the less I liked what I was reading. They were the prints of something that walked on 2 legs, like a man, but they were not a man's. They were too long and too narrow at the heel and too spread at the front, and there were marks at the front of each one that a boot does not make, that a bare foot does not make. The marks of something between toes and claws. The stride between them was longer than mine by half again, and the depth of them said the thing that made them was heavy, far heavier than its size, pressing those prints deep into snow that barely took my own weight. And they did not behave like the tracks of any animal I have ever cut. They did not wander or forage or cross the bench on their way to somewhere. They circled. They came out of the trees where Amos had gone in, and they circled the cabin, once, twice, many times over the days, a worn ring of them in the snow, all the way around the 4 walls, the way a thing paces the edge of a thing it has not finished with, and every circuit passed close by the door, and at the door, every time, they stopped, and stood, and faced it, before moving on. I went into the cabin. The door was shut but not barred. Inside it was cold as a tomb, the stove long dead, and it was tidy, an old solitary man's tidy. The bunk made, the few dishes clean, the wood in the box, everything in its place. A cabin a man had walked out of meaning to come right back, and never had. His winter food was all there. His other rifle was on its pegs. His journal, the trapping log every one of those men keeps, was on the table, and I read the last entries, and they are the only documents in this whole account, and they were short, the way a hard old man writes, but they told their own piece of it. The last week of entries changed. They started ordinary, weather and trap lines and the freeze coming. Then, a few days before the end, a line that said the dogs would not go out, that his 2 old trap dogs had taken to the cabin and would not leave it and growled at the night. Amos had no dogs that I ever found, by the way. I do not know what became of them. Then a line that said something was working the edge of the bench after dark, that he had heard it on the snow, heavy, and that it had paced the cabin in the night. Then a line, the second to last thing the man ever wrote, that I have not been able to put out of my mind, that said only this. It said the tracks in the morning were wrong, that they came up to the cabin but did not leave it, that there were prints arriving and none departing, more arriving every night, and never any leaving, as if the thing that made them came each night and never went away, as if it were still here, adding itself to the snow around his walls night after night, and never once leaving. And the last entry, the final thing Amos Tiller wrote, was one line in a hand that had gone shaky, and it said, "I cannot stay in here with it out there one more night. I am going to go and finish it, or it will finish me." And then he had taken his rifle, and gone out fast, and fired one shot into the trees, and walked into them, and the snow says he never came back. I stood in that cold cabin with the dead man's journal in my hands, and I understood several things at once. I understood that Amos Tiller was almost certainly dead, somewhere up in those black spruce. I understood that I was a half-mile from a bush plane, with a pilot waiting, and that the only sane thing in the world was to walk back down that frozen river right now, get in that plane and fly out and bring back a team in numbers and in daylight. And I understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, that I had been on that bench for the better part of an hour reading those tracks, and that the light was already failing, because at that latitude in late September the day is short and getting shorter, and that the gray afternoon was sliding toward the long blue dusk, and that I had badly misjudged how much of my 3 hours I had spent kneeling over the story written in the snow. I left the cabin and started back down the river fast, and I had gone no more than a few hundred yards when I heard, behind me, up on the bench by the cabin I had just left, the crunch of something heavy stepping down into the snow. One step, then a long pause, then another, slow, deliberate, the exact unhurried weight of the thing that had paced that cabin for a week, and it was up there now, in the failing light, and it had come out, and it had my track to follow. A fresh, warm track leading straight down the river to the plain, and I did the math no person ever wants to do, which was that the thing was between me and the cabin, and the plain was still most of a half-mile ahead, and the light was going, and I was not going to make it to Sig before whatever was behind me decided what it wanted to do. I did not run. That is the one thing I did right, and I did it on instinct from 9 years in that country, because you do not run from a predator. Running makes you prey. Running tells the thing behind you that you are a thing that flees and can be chased. I walked, fast, steady, my rifle in my hands now, not looking back, putting one boot ahead of the other down that frozen river while the light drained out of the sky and the steps came behind me, matching my pace, never closing, never falling back, pacing me the way the prince had paced the cabin, all the way down that river in the gathering dusk, close enough by the end that over the crunch of my own boots I could hear it breathing, a deep, slow, wet sound, in and out, far too large, far too close, and I have never wanted to turn and look at a thing less in my whole life, and I never did. I came around the last bend of the river to the gravel bar, and the plane was there, and Sigon was standing by it, and he took one look at my face and at the country behind me, and he did not ask one single question. He had the engine going before I reached the wing, and as I threw my pack in and climbed up after it, I looked back, finally, just once, down the river the way I had come, into the blue gloom under the spruce, and I saw it, for less than a second, at the edge of the trees where the gravel bar met the forest. A tall, narrow, wrong shape, standing upright and motionless and watching, taller than a man, the gloom and the distance mercifully taking the details, and then Sig had the throttle open, and we were bouncing down that frozen gravel bar, and the shape did not move. It only watched us go, and then the tundra tires left the gravel, and we were climbing, and the valley fell away below us, gray and white and still, with that small dead cabin on its bench, and that small upright shape at the edge of the trees, and I have never been so glad to leave a place in my life. Except we did not leave it. That is the part I have not told you yet, because the weather Sig had warned me about came in faster than even he had thought it would, and it caught us in the air, and it did not let us out of that range. The storm came down off the north slope like a wall, and it caught us before we were 10 minutes out of Amos Tiller's valley. One moment we were climbing through gray air with the range spread out below us, and the next the visibility closed down to nothing, a white roaring blindness of snow and wind, the little plane bucking and dropping. And Sig Aun, the calmest man I ever flew with, had both hands locked on the controls and was saying low, steady things to the airplane the way Roy Naquin used to talk to his swamp. A constant murmur of "do not do that, there you go, easy now, hold together." He could not climb over it, he could not see through it, and he made the only call a 30-year bush pilot can make in that situation, which is that he was not going to fly a Super Cub blind into a mountain, and that he was going to put us down on the first thing he could find to put us down on while he could still see the ground at all. What he found was a long, open ridge bench, wind-scoured and nearly bare of snow, and he set that plane down on it in a crosswind, in a whiteout, in a landing that I will not try to describe except to say that I have thought since that Sig Aun earned his whole life in that 1 minute. We came to a stop intact, more or less, and Sig shut it down, and we sat in the screaming white with the wind rocking the wings, and he spat his gum into a wrapper and put in a fresh piece and said, "Well, we are down, and we are not going anywhere until this blows out. Could be a day, could be 3. And then he told me the thing that turned a survival situation into the worst night of my life. He said the ridge bench we had landed on was, by his reckoning, only a couple of miles overland from Amos Tiller's valley. We had not gotten out of that country at all. We had come down right on the lip of it. There was a shelter cabin on that bench. That was the one piece of luck in it, and it was the reason Sig had picked that bench over any other, because he had known it was there. It was an old Park Service patrol cabin, a tiny one-room log shelter kept stocked with a stove and firewood and emergency rations for exactly this kind of situation, a place for a downed pilot or a stranded ranger to wait out the weather. We got the plane tied down as best we could, and we fought our way the 100 yards through the whiteout to that cabin, and we got inside, and we got the stove going, and for the first time in hours I let myself believe we might be all right, that we would wait out the storm in a stout cabin with a fire and food, and fly out when it broke, and put that gray valley and the thing in it behind us for good. We were not all right, because the thing from the valley came across those 2 miles in the storm, and it found us. It started a few hours into the night, when the storm was at its worst, the wind a solid roaring wall against the cabin walls. Over the top of the wind I heard it, the crunch of a heavy step in the snow outside, close to the wall. Then the long pause, then another, and I looked up, and I saw that Sig Aun had heard it too, that he had gone still with a stick of firewood in his hand, his head cocked, listening, and that the easy dryness had gone out of his face. The steps came around the cabin, slow, deliberate, the same weight, the same patience, the same unhurried circling that the snow around Amos Tiller's cabin had recorded over a week of nights, and it was here now, 2 miles across a mountain in a whiteout that should have killed any living thing caught out in it, circling our walls in the screaming gloom. Sig asked me, very low, what it was. I told him the truth, which was that I did not know, and that I had seen its track, and that it had taken Amos Tiller, and that the one thing I was sure of was that we were not going to open that door, not for anything, until the sun was up and the storm was gone. Sig Aun was not a man who frightened easily, but he was a man who had flown that country for 30 years and listened to the things the village people said and quietly believed more of them than he let on, and he did not argue with me. He set down the firewood, and he picked up the rifle, and we put our backs to the far wall, and we watched the door, and we waited. It circled us all night. Hour after hour, that slow, heavy step in the snow, around and around the cabin, close against the walls, and every circuit it would stop at the door and stand, and we would hear it breathe, that deep, wet sound, on the other side of 2 inches of old spruce, close enough that twice I saw the door shift very slightly in its frame as something leaned its weight against it, testing it, patient, and then the steps would move on and circle again. It did not roar, it did not throw itself against the door, it did not try to break in. It was in no hurry at all. It had crossed a mountain in a killing storm to be at our door, and now that it was here, it simply waited and circled and breathed and let us feel it out there. And I came to understand, over those hours, that the patience was the worst of it, that this was a thing that had all the time in the world, that had paced Amos Tiller's cabin for a week before he broke and went out to it, and that it was prepared to do the same to us, to wait at the edge of our light and our warmth until the waiting did to our minds what it had done to that old man's, until one of us could not stand it one more hour and threw open the door and went out to finish it or be finished. Near the worst hour of that night, it tested us a different way. The steps stopped, the breathing stopped, and after a long silence, from just outside the door, in the gap between the gusts of wind, there came a voice, an old man's voice, thin and frightened and cold, and it said, "Hello, the cabin. This is Amos Tiller. I am froze near to death out here. For the love of God, let me in." And it was good. It was an old, solitary man's voice. Exactly. But Amos Tiller had been dead in those spruce for days, and I had read it in the snow, and I put my hand hard on Sigon's arm, because Sig had started up off the wall, and I held him there, and I shook my head, and I watched the understanding come into his face, that the thing at the door was wearing a dead man's voice to call us out into the night. It tried only the once. I think it was not very good at it yet. The way the journal said the tracks were still learning, still adding themselves night after night. It went back to circling after that, and the wind covered the rest, and we sat against that wall with the rifle, and did not sleep, and did not speak, and watched that door until the small window grayed at last with the slow Arctic dawn. And in the first gray light, the circling stopped, and did not start again. The storm had begun to break with the day, the wind dropping, the white thinning. We waited a long time before we dared open the door. When we finally did, the snow around the cabin told the same story Amos Tiller's journal had told. A worn ring of those long, heavy, two-legged prints all the way around the walls, many circuits deep, every one passing the door, and at the door the snow-packed flat where something had stood and stood and stood through the night. And the prints came in toward the cabin from the direction of the valley. But there was no clear line of them leaving. They came, and they circled, and at some point in the dawn they simply stopped being added, with no trail going away. Exactly as the old man had written, prints arriving and none departing, and I have never been able to explain that, and I have stopped trying. And it is the single detail out of all of this that visits me most in the night. The storm blew out by midday, and Sigon got us off that ridge. He dug the plane out and checked it over with his hands shaking from cold and no sleep, and he found it sound, and he flew us out of that range in clear, hard blue air. The country below us blinding white and beautiful and utterly silent, and neither of us said one word the whole way back to the village. And when the gravel strip came into sight under the wings, I felt something in my chest let go that I had been holding since I first knelt over those tracks on Amos Tiller's bench. We reported it the only way it could be reported. Amos Tiller, overdue trapper, found to have left his cabin in distress and not returned, presumed to have died of exposure or a fall in the backcountry after firing on what was likely a bear at his cabin, body not recovered. A team went in when the weather settled, in numbers, in daylight, and they searched the spruce where his tracks led, and they found one of his mittens, and a long way on, in a place no man drags himself to with a wound, what little the country had left of Amos Tiller, and they wrote it up as a bear, because a bear is a thing the world believes, and the bears in that range are big enough to be believed. And I signed the report, and I did not write one word about the prints that circled the cabin, or the ones that arrived and never left, or the voice at our door in the storm. There was no place to write it that would not have ended my career and changed nothing. The wild north takes people every year. The reports keep the rest. I lost 2 fingers off my left hand to that night. Frostbite, from the cold of the ridge and the long hours against the cabin wall with no sleep and no movement, and I did not even feel them go, and they took them later in the clinic in town, and I wear the gloves now that hide it, and when people ask I tell them frostbite from a bad night in the backcountry, which is true and is a fraction of the truth. They ache before weather. They are a clock that keeps the time of that ridge, the way another man's knee keeps the time of a gorge 1,000 miles south of here. And I have come to think that all of us who have stood at the edge of one of these things and lived carry some small part of our bodies that the country kept, as a kind of toll, a reminder, a mark that says you were close and you got away. And do not think for one moment that getting away was free. I went to see Joe Tritt, the old Gwich'in elder, when it was over. I do not fully know why, the same way Emil down in his swamp did not fully know why he went to his old woman. The same way I think every one of us, when we have brushed up against one of these things, goes looking for someone older and closer to the old knowing to tell us we are not insane. I told Joe Tritt that Amos Tiller was dead, and where, and how, and I told him, because I could not tell someone, about the tracks that circled the cabin and arrived and never left. Joe Tritt listened to all of it without one change in his face, and when I was done he was quiet for a while, and then he said only this. He said, "That valley is one of the ones we do not go into. My father did not go into it. His father did not. There are a few places in this country that belong to something else, and we have always known which ones, and we leave them be, and we are still here after all this time, and that is not an accident." He did not name it. He did not explain it. He did not pretend to know more than he knew. He just told me gently that the old people had always known to stay out of that valley, and that Amos Tiller had wintered in it alone for 40 years because he was from outside and did not know, or knew and did not believe, and that knowing and believing in time is the whole of the difference between the ones who come home and the ones who do not. And then he made me coffee, and we talked of other things, and that was the most anyone ever told me, and it was enough. Here is the part I have never put in any report. The part that is the reason I am telling you all of this tonight. I still ranger that country. I cannot leave it. The big silent white emptiness of it is the only thing that ever quieted the thing inside me, and most of it, the daylight miles of it, the caribou rivers and the gray peaks and the long gold autumn tundra, is the great love of my life and always will be. But I do not fly up that side drainage anymore, and the park has quietly let Amos Tiller's cabin fall in on itself and does not send anyone up that valley, and I have made sure, in the small ways a man in my position can, that no permit ever sends a soul up there again. And I do not winter at a remote cabin alone anymore, not for any reason, because of the one thing that has happened since, that I have told no one until now. 2 winters ago I was weathered in for a night at a different patrol cabin, far from that valley, ordinary country I trusted. And deep in that night, over the wind, I heard it, the slow heavy step in the snow outside, the long pause, the circling, around and around the walls, close, patient, and at the door. Every circuit, the stop, and the stand, and the deep wet breathing on the other side of the wood. It had found me again, or one of them had, 100 miles from that valley, in country that was supposed to be safe, and it circled my cabin the whole of that night exactly as it had circled Amos Tiller's, and once, near the worst hour, a voice that was Sig Oni's voice, who had flown south to Arizona to his grandchildren 2 years before and was alive and well and warm in the desert, called to me from outside the door, and told me his plane was down and that he was hurt, and asked me to come out and help him. I did not answer it. I did not open the door. I put my back to the far wall with my rifle across my knees, and I watched that door until the dawn, and in the morning the snow had the ring of prints around the walls, and the prints came in and did not leave, and I packed my gear and I walked out and I did not look back. So if you take one thing from a tired old Arctic hand tonight, take this. If you are ever wintering somewhere truly remote, somewhere truly cold and far from the lights of other people, and you wake in the night to the sound of something heavy walking a slow circle around your walls, around and around, patient, in no hurry, stopping at your door to stand and to breathe, then you must understand that it is not trying to break in. It does not need to. It is going to wait at the edge of your light and your warmth as long as it takes, until the waiting wears your mind down to where you cannot stand one more circuit of it, and you throw open the door and walk out to face it, the way a hard old man finally did, because the not knowing became worse than the dying. Do not open the door. Do not answer the voice, no matter whose it is. Do not walk out to finish it. Keep the fire up and your back to the wall and wait for the light. The circling stops when the sun comes. It always stops when the sun comes. And in the morning you walk out into the cold and the brightness and you go, and you do not look back at the ring it left in the snow, and you do not ever, as long as you live, winter alone again in the country where it found you. Because the snow does not lie. And some nights it writes the same circle around your walls that it wrote around the walls of every man who did not come home before you. The only difference between you and them is whether you have learned while there is still light to learn it by, to sit still inside your four walls and let it circle and never once go out to see what is making the prints that come and never leave. This happened when I was in middle school back in 2009. I was about 12 years old, living in a small town on the outskirts of Seattle, where nothing extraordinary ever happened. My days consisted of homework, video games, and occasionally riding bikes with neighborhood friends, until that weekend in late October that changed everything. The invitation came on a Tuesday during lunch period. My friend Grace, a girl with wild curly hair and an adventurous spirit who had moved to our town just 6 months prior, slid a handmade card across the cafeteria table. The paper was adorned with glitter and cartoon forest animals. "My parents are letting me have a camping birthday party this weekend," she announced proudly. "They rented a cabin by Evergreen Lake. You have to come." I opened the card, finding details written in her characteristically messy handwriting. The camping ground was nestled deep in the Olympic Peninsula, a 3-hour drive from civilization. The thought of being so isolated made me hesitate. "It's going to be amazing," Grace continued, noticing my uncertainty. "My uncle works as a ranger there. He says there's a lake perfect for swimming, trails for hiking, and the stars are incredible at night." I nodded, trying to seem enthusiastic. Truth was, I'd never been camping before. My parents were the indoor type, preferring air conditioning and room service to tents and campfires. But Grace had been nothing but kind to me since arriving at our school, and I didn't want to disappoint her. "Who else is coming?" I asked. "Hannah, Darius, and Jin from our class. My cousin Tamara, too," she replied. That night, I convinced my parents it would be educational, a chance to learn about nature and survival skills. What I didn't tell them was how an inexplicable feeling of dread had settled in my stomach when I thought about those deep, dark woods. Friday afternoon came quickly. My mom dropped me off at Grace's house where her father, a tall, bearded man with kind eyes, was loading camping supplies into their SUV. Hannah and Jin were already there, excited and chattering about ghost stories they planned to tell around the campfire. "You brought a flashlight, right?" Jin asked me, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Grace's cousin says the cabin doesn't have great lighting." I patted my backpack. "Two, and extra batteries." The drive took longer than expected. What started as suburbs gave way to increasingly remote landscapes. Cell phone service disappeared about 90 minutes in, and the radio stations faded to static not long after. Grace's father kept us entertained with stories from his own childhood camping trips, but I couldn't help noticing how the forests grew denser and darker as we traveled. Darius and Tamara were meeting us there directly. As we turned onto an unmarked gravel road, the SUV bumped and jostled us. Through the windows, I watched the sunlight fracture through pine branches, creating unsettling patterns that moved across my lap like spectral fingers. "Almost there," Grace's father announced as we passed a weathered wooden sign reading, "Evergreen Lake Campgrounds, Esther, 1953. The road ended at a small clearing where another car was parked. Darius waved from a picnic table, Tamara beside him looking bored. Beyond them stood our cabin, smaller and more dilapidated than I had imagined. Its wooden exterior was gray with age, the windows small and dark like vacant eyes. Behind it, barely visible through the trees, I caught the silver gleam of water, Evergreen Lake. "Don't look so worried," Grace whispered, nudging my shoulder. "It's better inside, and wait until you see the stars tonight." I forced a smile, but couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching us. The cabin's interior smelled of dust and pine. 2 small bedrooms with bunk beds flanked a central living area with a wood stove, a worn couch, and a table with mismatched chairs. A crude kitchenette occupied one corner, complete with a propane stove and an ancient refrigerator that hummed ominously. "Home sweet home," Grace announced, claiming a top bunk by tossing her sleeping bag onto it. Grace's father stored our food in metal containers. "To keep the animals out," he explained, and helped us gather firewood before preparing to leave. "Uncle Roy will check on you kids tomorrow morning," he told Grace, handing her a 2-way radio. "Channel 3 if you need anything. The ranger station is just 2 miles down the road." The adults' departure left a strange silence. We stood awkwardly in the cabin until Tamara, older than us at 15, took charge. "Let's explore before it gets dark," she suggested. "I want to see this amazing lake Grace keeps talking about." The path to the lake was overgrown but visible, winding through trees that seemed to lean inward as we passed. I noticed claw marks on some trunks. Bear activity, I assumed, recalling the safety videos we'd watched in science class. The thought made my throat tighten. Evergreen Lake emerged suddenly through the trees. Despite my unease, I had to admit it was beautiful. A perfect oval of dark water surrounded by towering pines, its surface reflecting the cloud-streaked sky. A small wooden dock extended about 20 feet into the water. "Last one in is a rotten egg," Darius shouted, kicking off his shoes. Jin followed immediately, both boys cannonballing into the water with excited yells. I hesitated, noticing how the water swallowed their bodies, how dark it looked below the surface. Something about the stillness of the farther shore disturbed me, the way the trees there seemed denser, the shadows deeper. "You coming?" Hannah asked, already wading in. "Maybe later," I said. "I'll watch the backpacks." From my position on the dock, I studied our surroundings, trying to dismiss my growing anxiety. That's when I first noticed it, a strange silence. The forest sounds, birds, insects, wind in the branches, had completely ceased. As dusk approached, we returned to the cabin to prepare Grace's birthday celebration. Tamara had brought battery-powered lanterns that cast long shadows across the walls. Jin and Darius gathered stones to build a fire pit outside, while Hannah and I helped Grace arrange her birthday cupcakes on a plastic plate. "Sorry it's not a proper cake," Hannah said. Grace smiled. "Are you kidding? Camping cupcakes are the best." The fire crackled warmly, pushing back the darkness that had settled among the trees. We sang Happy Birthday, our voices sounding small against the vast wilderness surrounding us. After eating, we roasted marshmallows and told stories. "My dad says these forests have the highest rate of disappearances in the state," Darius claimed, his face eerily lit from below by his flashlight. Tamara rolled her eyes. "That's just to scare tourists away from his hunting spots." "No, it's true," Darius insisted. "People go hiking and never come back. They find their cameras sometimes with the last photos just showing trees. Normal forest stuff. Nothing scary in the pictures, but the people, gone." Jin shuddered visibly. "Can we talk about something else?" We shifted to school gossip and video games, but I found my attention repeatedly drawn to the edge of our light's reach, where the forest waited in absolute blackness. Occasionally I thought I saw movement, just a quick displacement of shadow, but convinced myself it was the fire's flickering light playing tricks. After the cupcakes and stories, Grace suggested we walk back to the lake to stargaze. The idea of returning to the water in darkness made my stomach clench, but everyone else agreed enthusiastically. Tamara led our procession, swinging her powerful flashlight in wide arcs that briefly illuminated twisted tree trunks and undergrowth before returning them to darkness. The path seemed longer at night, more convoluted. Twice I was certain we had taken a wrong turn, but Tamara moved with confidence. Finally, the trees opened up, and we stood again at the lake's edge. Above us, the night sky blazed with more stars than I had ever seen, the Milky Way a smear of light across the darkness. Despite my earlier misgivings, I felt momentarily awestruck. We sprawled on the dock, pointing out constellations and watching for shooting stars. For a while I forgot my unease, lost in the vastness above. Then I heard it, a splashing sound from across the lake. The splashing continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I propped myself up on my elbows, squinting into the darkness. The far shore was barely visible, a black line against the slightly less black water. "What's that noise?" I whispered, not wanting to break the night's stillness completely. At first, no one responded. Then Grace sat up beside me. Probably just a deer getting a drink. But it didn't sound like an animal lapping at water. It was more purposeful, like something stirring the lake's surface with intent. I placed my hand on Hannah's arm. "What is that?" I asked, louder this time. One by one, the others sat up, following my gaze across the water. The splashing stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. "I don't see anything," Darius said, but his voice wavered. Tamara switched on her flashlight, pointing it toward the sound's origin. The beam traveled across the water but dissipated before reaching the opposite shore. Still, in that brief illumination, I caught a glimpse of something pale against the darkness, a figure at the water's edge. "There's someone over there," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Jin fumbled for his own flashlight. When he aimed it across the lake, we all saw it clearly for the first time. A white figure was hunched at the lake's edge, impossibly thin limbs extending into the water. It wasn't moving, but somehow I knew it was aware of us, aware of our lights, our voices, our presence. "What is that?" Grace's voice had risen an octave. We watched, transfixed, as the figure slowly withdrew its elongated arms from the water. It remained crouched for several heartbeats, unmoving. Then it turned its head toward us. Even from this distance I could see its eyes, or rather the absence of them. Just dark hollows in a pale face. My breathing became shallow, my muscles tensing with primitive fear. The figure rose to its full height, taller than any human should be, its proportions all wrong. For one terrible moment, it simply stood there, regarding us across the water. Then it began to move. "Run," Tamara whispered, then louder. "Run!" We scrambled off the dock, flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we searched for the path back to the cabin. Behind us, I heard splashing, violent and fast, something moving through water with unnatural speed. "This way!" Grace shouted, finding the trail. We ran in a tight group, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. The splash of the creature leaving the water, followed by the sound of wet, heavy footsteps on the shore, then the cracking of undergrowth as it entered the forest behind us. A growl rose from the darkness, not the growl of any animal I'd ever heard, but something that mimicked the sound while getting it horribly wrong. The noise seemed to come from a throat not designed for such vocalizations. "It's gaining on us," Jin cried, his voice breaking with terror. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. In the bouncing beams of our flashlights, I caught glimpses of a pale form moving through the trees with terrible efficiency. Sometimes on two legs, sometimes on all fours, its body bending in ways that defied anatomy. Hannah stumbled beside me, her foot caught in a root. I grabbed her arm, yanking her forward as we continued our desperate flight. The path seemed to have lengthened impossibly, the cabin nowhere in sight. The creature's breathing grew louder, a wet, rasping sound that seemed to surround us rather than come from a single point behind. The forest floor trembled with its pursuit, dead leaves and pine needles scattering in its wake. Finally, the cabin appeared ahead, its dark windows offering the promise of sanctuary. We burst through the clearing, Tamara reaching the door first and flinging it open. We piled inside, collapsing on the floor as Darius slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. For several terrible moments, we huddled together in the darkness, our breathing ragged, listening. Outside, something circled the cabin, heavy footsteps on the porch, a scraping along the walls, the creak of weight on the roof. The windows rattled as if being tested. "What was that thing?" Hannah sobbed, her face buried against Grace's shoulder. No one answered. No one had to. We had all seen it, and none of us had words to adequately describe the wrongness of the creature. How it seemed almost human, but fundamentally, horrifically not. Eventually, the sounds outside ceased. We remained frozen, afraid that any movement or noise might remind the creature of our presence. Hours passed in terrified silence, no one willing to check if it was truly gone. "We should call for help," Jin finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Grace nodded and retrieved the two-way radio her father had left. With trembling fingers, she switched it to channel 3 and pressed the talk button. "Uncle Roy, are you there? We need help. There's something outside the cabin." Static answered her. She tried again, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, anyone, we need help at Cabin 7, Evergreen Lake." More static, then a burst of sound that might have been a voice, but the words were indistinguishable. Grace adjusted the frequency, trying again and again, but we couldn't establish clear communication. "The mountains," Tamara said flatly. "They block the signal sometimes." Darius had been peering through a gap in the window curtains. "I don't see anything out there now." "It doesn't matter," I said. "We're not going outside until morning." We barricaded the door with the couch and pushed the heavy table against the most vulnerable window. Taking inventory of our supplies, we found enough water and snacks to last until Grace's father returned tomorrow. We agreed to take shifts staying awake, 2 at a time, watching the windows and door. During my watch with Grace, sometime in the darkest part of night, she whispered, "I'm sorry I brought you here." I looked at her face, pale in the weak light of our single remaining lantern, and saw genuine remorse there. "You couldn't have known," I replied. She shook her head. "That's the thing. There were stories. Uncle Roy told my dad about hikers seeing strange things in these woods. I thought they were just trying to scare us. You know, typical adult stuff to keep kids from wandering off. But now—" A soft sound outside interrupted her, a gentle scratching at the wall beside us. We froze, holding our breath. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. When it reached the window, I saw a pale hand with too many joints press against the glass for just a moment before withdrawing. Grace gripped my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. But neither of us made a sound. Eventually, the scratching faded. "It's testing us," I whispered, looking for a way in. We woke Tamara and Darius for the next watch, but I doubt any of us truly slept that night. I lay in my bunk, every muscle tense, listening to the occasional creak of the roof or scratch at the walls, wondering if the flimsy wooden structure would be enough to keep us safe until dawn. The night stretched endlessly, each minute an exercise in terror. I found myself praying silently, bargaining with God for the sun to rise quickly, promising anything in exchange for morning light. First light arrived with excruciating slowness, a gradual lessening of darkness rather than a triumphant brightness. We gathered in the main room, pale and exhausted, no one having slept more than minutes at a time. "Should we try the radio again?" Hannah asked. Before anyone could answer, we heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching, tires on gravel, an engine rumbling. We rushed to the windows, half expecting another trick, but instead saw a Forest Service truck pulling into the clearing. Grace's Uncle Roy stepped out looking concerned. We removed our barricade and flung open the door, tumbling out into the morning light with relief and frantic explanations. "Whoa, slow down," Roy said, holding up his hands. "What happened? We couldn't get a clear signal on the radio." We took turns describing our encounter, the figure across the lake, the chase through the forest, the night of terror as it circled our cabin. With each detail, Roy's expression grew more serious. "Let's take a look around," he finally said, retrieving a rifle from his truck. We followed him reluctantly to the lake, no one wanting to go, but all needing confirmation of what we'd seen. In daylight, Evergreen Lake looked deceptively peaceful, its surface glassy and undisturbed. "There," I pointed to the far shore. "That's where we saw it first." Roy nodded and led us along the perimeter of the lake. As we approached the opposite shore, we discovered a trail of destruction, vegetation crushed and torn, the muddy bank churned up with unusual indentations that couldn't quite be called footprints. "What made these?" Darius asked, his voice hushed. Roy crouched, examining the marks without touching them. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but you kids aren't the first to report seeing something strange around here." He stood, scanning the dense forest beyond the disturbed area. "About 10 years ago, there was a research facility a few miles from here. Government-funded, very secretive. Some kind of environmental science project, supposedly studying the unique ecosystem of these woods." "What happened to it?" Grace asked. "Officially, funding got cut, project abandoned. Unofficially," he hesitated, "there was an incident. Some kind of containment breach. They evacuated the facility overnight, brought in hazmat teams. The whole area is still restricted." "You think whatever we saw came from there?" I asked, my mind racing with horrific possibilities. A test subject, a genetic experiment gone wrong, exposed to something that warped its body and mind. Roy shrugged. "I'm not saying that, just telling you what I know." He pointed to the trail leading away from the lake, deeper into the forest. "Those marks head east, away from the campground. Whatever it was, is gone now." But I wasn't convinced. As we walked back to the cabin to gather our things, Grace's father had been called and was already on his way to collect us. I felt watched. Every shadow in the trees seemed to conceal something waiting, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. We left Evergreen Lake that afternoon, none of us speaking much during the long drive home. I told my parents we'd gotten spooked by normal forest noises, not wanting to worry them, or worse, have them dismiss our experience entirely. In the years since, I've researched extensively, looking into government facilities in the Olympic Peninsula, unexplained disappearances in national parks, unidentified creatures sighted in the Pacific Northwest. I found nothing conclusive, just fragments and rumors, whispers of something not quite human living in those remote forests. Sometimes I wake in the night, certain I've heard scratching at my window. On those occasions, I lie perfectly still until dawn, remembering how that creature moved, with purpose and patience, hunting not from hunger but from some darker, more deliberate motivation. I never went camping again. And whenever friends mention Evergreen Lake, I find reasons to be elsewhere, because I know what waits there in the darkness, watching from across the water, its hollow eyes fixed on the warm lights of human habitation, biding its time. Summer break had just begun, and the weight of 7th grade finally lifted from my shoulders. I was 13 that year, 2019, a time when most kids my age were glued to their phones or gaming consoles. Not me, though. My parents couldn't afford the latest technology, and our family vacations consisted of weekend trips to visit my grandmother 2 towns over. That's why when my best friend Samantha approached me with a glossy brochure for Camp Evergreen, I felt a surge of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. The brochure showcased smiling girls canoeing across a serene lake, hiking through lush forests, and gathering around crackling campfires. It looked like something straight out of a movie, nothing like the mundane summers I was used to. My mom signed me up already, Samantha said, her eyes bright with anticipation. 2 full weeks. She said I could bring a friend, and I immediately thought of you. I stared at the pictures, tracing my finger over the pristine lake. Camp Evergreen was nestled in the mountains, approximately 3 hours from our hometown. The thought of being so far from home made my stomach twist with both excitement and apprehension. I've never been away from home that long, I admitted, but couldn't hide my growing enthusiasm. It'll be amazing, Samantha insisted. We'll swim, hike, make new friends. Please say yes. That evening, I showed the brochure to my parents. To my surprise, they agreed almost immediately. My mother commented that it would be good for me to experience nature instead of spending another summer helping her around the house. My father seemed relieved at the prospect of one less mouth to feed for 2 weeks. They weren't being cruel. Money was just always tight. In the days leading up to our departure, I packed and repacked my duffel bag, checked items off the camp's recommended list, and tried to imagine what awaited me. I'd never been a particularly adventurous child. The closest I'd come to camping was sleeping in our backyard when the summer heat made our house unbearable. The night before we left, I had my first nightmare. I was swimming in dark water, unable to see more than a few inches in front of me. Something brushed against my leg, a cold, firm grip that pulled me deeper. I woke gasping for air, my sheets damp with sweat. I dismissed it as pre-camp jitters and didn't mention it to anyone. I should have recognized it for what it was, a warning. The journey to Camp Evergreen was filled with Samantha's excited chatter and her mother's occasional interjections about her own camp experiences from decades ago. I half listened, watching through the window as suburban landscapes gave way to increasingly dense forests and winding mountain roads. As we turned onto a gravel path marked with a wooden sign reading Camp Evergreen, Empowering Young Women. Since 1972, I felt a peculiar sensation. The air seemed to thicken, and the lush trees lining the entrance cast long shadows across our path. The sun, bright and cheerful throughout our drive, now struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. "We're here," Samantha squealed, pressing her face against the window as a cluster of rustic cabins came into view. The main lodge was a massive log structure with a wraparound porch, where several adults in forest green polo shirts stood welcoming arrivals. Beyond it, I could see glimpses of the lake, its surface reflecting the afternoon light like a mirror. As we exited the car, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Despite dozens of girls and parents milling about, there was an unnatural stillness to the place. No birds sang in the trees. No insects buzzed. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Welcome to Camp Evergreen." A woman with a clipboard approached us, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm Ms. Winters, the camp director." Ms. Winters had the weathered look of someone who spent most of her time outdoors. Tanned skin, crow's feet around her eyes, and calloused hands. She checked our names off her list and assigned us to Cabin Pine, explaining that we'd meet our counselor at orientation. "You girls are in for a special summer," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "We have many exciting activities planned." Samantha's mother helped us carry our bags to our cabin, hugged us both tightly, and promised to return in 2 weeks. As her car disappeared down the gravel road, I felt a twinge of unease. I was now farther from home than I'd ever been, surrounded by strangers in an unfamiliar place. Cabin Pine was rustic but comfortable, with 6 bunk beds, a small bathroom, and wooden chests for our belongings. 4 other girls were already unpacking. Twins named Hannah and Haley, a tall girl called Brianna, and a quiet, intense-looking girl named Josephine. "I heard they renovated all the cabins after what happened," Josephine said abruptly as she shoved clothes into a drawer. "After what?" I asked, selecting a bottom bunk near the window. Josephine looked around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You don't know about the drowning?" Before she could continue, the cabin door swung open and our counselor strode in. Iris was in her early 20s, with a perpetual smile and boundless energy. She clapped her hands to get our attention. "Welcome to Cabin Pine. Let's save the ghost stories for the campfire, shall we?" She gave Josephine a pointed look. "Orientation begins in 15 minutes at the main lodge. Don't be late." As we followed Iris to the main lodge, Samantha nudged me. "Don't let Josephine freak you out. Every camp has some story to scare the new kids." I nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Josephine's comment. The way our counselor had so quickly shut down the conversation seemed strange. What was the drowning she'd mentioned, and why did it necessitate cabin renovations? Orientation was a blur of rules, schedules, and introductions. We learned about the camp's history, founded by a woman who believed girls needed wilderness experiences to build character. The daily routine, wake at 7 a.m., lights out at 10 p.m., and the various activities available, swimming, canoeing, hiking, archery, crafts. Throughout the presentation, I found my attention drawn to the large windows overlooking the lake. The water was unnaturally still, a dark blue surface that reflected the surrounding trees like a perfect photograph. As the sun began to set, the lake's color deepened to an almost black hue. "That lake gives me the creeps," Brianna whispered beside me. "It's too quiet." She was right. Most lakes I'd seen had small waves, ripples from fish jumping, or water bugs skittering across the surface. This one was completely motionless, as if frozen in time. After orientation, we returned to our cabin for get-to-know-you games led by Iris. As we sat in a circle on the wooden floor, sharing facts about ourselves, I noticed Josephine's eyes repeatedly drifting to the window facing the lake. When we finally crawled into our bunks that night, exhausted from the long day, I heard Josephine whispering from her bed across the room. "Her name was Andrea Walsh," she said, barely audible. "She drowned here in 1996. They never found her body." I pulled my blanket tighter around me, trying to block out her words, but sleep remained elusive for hours. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with dark water and reaching hands. Morning arrived with the blaring of a bugle across the campgrounds. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. For a moment, the previous night's unease seemed foolish in the bright light of day. Iris herded us to the dining hall, a spacious building with long wooden tables and benches. The air was filled with the scent of bacon and pancakes and the chatter of nearly 100 excited girls. Samantha and I filled our trays and found seats at a table with girls from Cabin Birch. "Have you heard about the ghost?" a freckled girl named Grace asked as she slid onto the bench across from us. "Josephine mentioned something about a drowning," I admitted, keeping my voice low. Grace nodded eagerly. "Andrea Walsh. She was our age, 13, when it happened. They say she went swimming alone at night. Against the rules, obviously. The next morning they found her clothes on the dock. But no Andrea." "That's not what I heard," another girl interjected. I heard she was pushed by her counselor. That's ridiculous, Samantha said with an eye roll. If a counselor murdered a camper, the place would have been shut down. Not if they covered it up, Grace countered. My older sister came here 3 years ago. She said they don't let anyone swim in the deep part of the lake anymore. They've got buoys marking it off limits. I glanced out the window at the lake, visible in the distance. The morning sun glinted off its surface, making it appear almost inviting. It was hard to reconcile the beautiful scene with such a tragic story. Whatever happened, it was over 20 years ago, Samantha said firmly. I'm not letting some old story ruin my summer. After breakfast, our cabin group was scheduled for swimming lessons. We changed into our swimsuits and made our way down to the lake, where Iris and another counselor named Maya waited on the dock with clipboards. Up close, the lake was even more beautiful and more unsettling. The water was incredibly clear near the shore, allowing visibility several feet down to the sandy bottom. Further out, however, it darkened rapidly, the bottom disappearing into blackness. The swimming area is marked by the yellow buoys, Iris explained, pointing to a roped-off section of the lake. Beyond that, the lake drops off quickly to over 30 feet deep. No one swims past the buoys, ever. Understood? We all nodded solemnly. I couldn't help noticing how the other counselor, Maya, stared out at the deep water with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Something between fear and reverence. After assessing our swimming abilities, we were divided into groups. Being a strong swimmer, I was placed in the advanced group with Samantha, Brianna, and several girls from other cabins. We practiced strokes while Iris watched from the dock, occasionally shouting instructions. The water was surprisingly warm for a mountain lake, almost unnaturally so. As I swam, I noticed how sound seemed to behave strangely underwater, muffled in a way that felt different from my experiences in public pools or the rare occasions I'd been to the beach. About 20 minutes into our lesson, I dove under to practice retrieving objects from the bottom. The counselors had tossed several colorful rings for us to retrieve. I spotted a red one near the boundary rope and swam toward it. As I reached for the ring, a shadow passed overhead, something large moving across the surface. Thinking it was another swimmer, I surfaced quickly, not wanting a collision. But when my head broke the water, I saw all the other girls still in their designated areas, none close enough to have cast the shadow I'd seen. The counselors remained on the dock, engaged in conversation. I treaded water, scanning the lake's surface. Nothing unusual was visible, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The back of my neck prickled with goosebumps, despite the warm water. "Everything okay?" Samantha called from a few yards away. "Yeah," I replied automatically, though nothing felt okay. Just thought I saw something. I returned to the group, but kept glancing back at the spot where I'd seen the shadow. For the remainder of the swimming lesson, I stayed in the shallowest part of the designated area, never letting my feet lose contact with the bottom. Later that afternoon, during free time, I sat on the cabin's small porch with my journal, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Perhaps it had been a large fish, or a shadow from a passing cloud. The rational explanations didn't ease my discomfort. Josephine emerged from the cabin and sat beside me, her dark eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "In the lake." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Felt what?" "That we're not alone in there." Josephine hugged her knees to her chest. "My older sister came here 4 years ago. She told me about Andrea. Said the lake changed after she drowned. Became warmer, quieter. Like something's absorbing all the energy." "It's just a lake," I said, not believing my own words. Josephine gave me a sad smile. "Andrea's family demanded an investigation after she disappeared. The police brought in divers, sonar equipment, everything. They never found a trace of her. It's like the lake just swallowed her." "People are found eventually," I argued. "Bodies float." "Not an evergreen lake," Josephine whispered. "Nothing that goes into the deep part ever comes back up." Before I could respond, Iris called us for the next activity. As I stood to leave, Josephine grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin with surprising strength. "Stay away from the deep water," she warned. "Andrea isn't the only one who never came back." The next few days passed in a blur of scheduled activities, new friendships, and forced normalcy. I threw myself into camp life, determined to enjoy the experience despite the unease that lingered at the edges of my consciousness. Samantha, oblivious to my concerns, thrived in the environment, quickly becoming a favorite among counselors for her enthusiasm and leadership qualities. Our third day at camp brought our cabin's turn for canoeing lessons. After breakfast, we gathered at the boathouse, a weathered structure extending partly over the water. Inside, rows of canoes hung from the ceiling, their hulls gleaming with fresh varnish. "Today you'll learn basic paddling techniques and water safety," explained Mr. Harmon, the elderly caretaker who ran the boating program. His leathery skin and calloused hands spoke of decades spent outdoors. "Each of you will take a canoe out. Follow my instructions carefully." We were fitted with life jackets and given paddles. One by one, we climbed into canoes while Mr. Harmon and Iris steadied them against the dock. When my turn came, I hesitated, staring down at the water lapping against the wooden structure. "Something wrong?" Mr. Harmon asked, noticing my reluctance. "No," I lied, forcing myself to step into the narrow vessel. It wobbled beneath me, and I gripped the sides with white knuckles. "That's it," he encouraged, as I settled onto the seat. "Keep your weight centered." He pushed my canoe away from the dock with surprising strength for his age. I dipped my paddle into the water as he demonstrated, making small, controlled strokes. The canoe glided smoothly across the surface, joining the others who were already practicing in a small cove near the boathouse. For several minutes, I felt a growing confidence. The repetitive motion of paddling was almost meditative, and the morning sun warmed my skin pleasantly. Perhaps I had been overthinking things. Perhaps the stories about Andrea Walsh were just that, stories. Then I noticed I'd drifted away from the group. Despite maintaining what I thought was a straight course, my canoe had somehow veered toward the center of the lake, past the swimming buoys that marked the drop-off to deeper water. I corrected my course, digging my paddle deeper to turn back toward the cove. The canoe didn't respond as expected. Instead of turning, it continued its path toward deeper water, as if pulled by an invisible current. I paddled harder, my arms burning with the effort, yet made no progress toward the shore. "You're too far out," Iris called from the dock, her voice carrying across the water. "Turn back toward the cove." "I'm trying," I shouted back, fighting against the inexplicable pull. Mr. Harmon quickly launched another canoe, powerful strokes carrying him toward me. As he approached, my canoe suddenly lurched to one side, nearly capsizing. I dropped my paddle in surprise and grabbed the gunnels to steady myself. The paddle didn't float as it should have. Instead, it sank immediately, disappearing into the darkness below. As I watched it vanish, something in the depths caught my eye, a pale shape moving against the blackness. Not the random movement of underwater currents, but the deliberate motion of something swimming, something large. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared into the water. The shape moved closer to the surface, growing more distinct. A face, human yet somehow wrong, materialized beneath my canoe. Pale, bloated features distorted by water and time, with dark holes where eyes should be. A mouth opened in what could have been a smile or a scream. I recoiled so violently that the canoe rocked dangerously. Water splashed over the sides, soaking my legs. The face disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the dark water below. Mr. Harmon reached me moments later, expertly maneuvering his canoe alongside mine. "Grab my paddle," he instructed, extending it toward me. "I'll tow you back." With trembling hands, I clutched the offered paddle. Mr. Harmon began rowing us both toward shore, his weathered face set in a grim expression. "Did you see something in the water?" he asked quietly, his eyes scanning the lake's surface. I hesitated. Would he believe me? Would anyone? I thought I saw a face. His paddling faltered for just a moment before resuming its steady rhythm. "The sun plays tricks on these waters," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Reflections, shadows. Easy to see things that aren't there." But his eyes told a different story. They held knowledge, perhaps fear. He knew something about this lake that he wasn't sharing. Back on shore, Iris wrapped a towel around my shoulders, mistaking my shaking for cold rather than terror. "You drifted into the current," she explained, rubbing my arms briskly. "It happens sometimes. That's why we always stay in the cove for lessons." What current? Samantha asked, standing nearby with the others. The lake looks perfectly still. Underwater currents, Mr. Harmon interjected. This lake has unusual hydrology. Underground springs create currents you can't see from the surface. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as if he'd given it many times before. The other girls accepted it without question, but I knew what I'd seen. No current had pulled my canoe. Something had wanted me in the deep water. That night, I lay awake long after lights out, listening to the steady breathing of my cabin mates. My mind replayed the face I'd seen, the hollow eyes, the grotesque smile. Was it Andrea Walsh? Or something else entirely? Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps on the wooden floor. Peeking through barely opened eyes, I saw Josephine slip out the cabin door. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I quietly followed, grabbing a flashlight from beside my bunk. The night was moonless, the camp illuminated only by a few security lights along the main paths. I caught a glimpse of Josephine's silhouette heading toward the lake and followed at a distance, careful to avoid twigs and other noisy debris on the ground. She stopped at the edge of the dock, gazing out over the water. I hid behind a nearby tree, watching as she knelt and placed something on the wooden planks. Flowers, I realized, a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from around the camp. "I know you're there," Josephine said suddenly without turning around. "You can come out." Startled, I stepped from my hiding place. "What are you doing?" "Paying respects," she replied simply. Andrea's birthday was yesterday. She would have been 36. I approached cautiously, standing beside her on the dock. The lake before us was a vast expanse of blackness, not even stars reflected on its unusually still surface. "How do you know so much about her?" I asked. Josephine was quiet for a long moment. "Andrea was my aunt. My mother's younger sister." The revelation struck me speechless. This wasn't just camp folklore to her. It was family history, personal tragedy. "My mother never got over it," Josephine continued. "She visits the lake every year on Andrea's birthday. This year she couldn't come, so I promised I'd leave flowers for her." "I'm sorry," I said inadequately. "About your aunt." "They said she drowned accidentally," Josephine's voice hardened, but my mother never believed it. Andrea was an excellent swimmer, and she wasn't alone that night. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What do you mean?" "She was with her counselor, Ms. Winters." The name hit me like a physical blow. "The camp director? She was here when it happened?" Josephine nodded. "She was Andrea's counselor that summer. The police questioned her, but she claimed Andrea snuck out alone after lights out. No one could prove otherwise." My mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed. Ms. Winters's strange demeanor, the way the counselors avoided discussing the lake's history, Mr. Harmon's practiced explanation of underwater currents. "I saw something in the lake today," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could reconsider. "A face, under my canoe." Josephine didn't seem surprised. "Others have seen her too. The camp covers it up, calls them hallucinations or tricks of light. But I know better." "What really happened to her?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I don't know for certain," Josephine replied, "but I intend to find out before camp ends, and I think you're meant to help me." As if in response to her words, the still surface of the lake suddenly rippled, a single, perfect circle, expanding outward from a central point, as if something large had risen briefly before sinking again into the depths. We both took an involuntary step back from the edge. "Something's happening," Josephine whispered. "The lake is changing. Andrea's getting stronger." "What do you mean, stronger?" "Every year there are more sightings, more incidents. Last summer, a girl nearly drowned during a night swim. Said something grabbed her ankle and wouldn't let go. I thought of my canoe being pulled toward deeper water against all my efforts to turn back. We should tell someone." "Who? Ms. Winters? The counselors? They're all part of it." Josephine gathered her flashlight. "Meet me tomorrow night after lights out. Bring your swimsuit." "My swimsuit? Why would I?" "We're going to find proof," she interrupted. "In the boathouse. There are records there, logs from every summer, including 1996. As we crept back to our cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by whoever might be patrolling the grounds, but by something else. Something that dwelled in the unnaturally still waters of Evergreen Lake and had been waiting patiently for 23 years. The following day passed with excruciating slowness. Every activity, every meal, every conversation seemed to drag on endlessly as I waited for nightfall. I went through the motions of camp life mechanically, my mind preoccupied with what Josephine had shared and what we planned to do. Samantha noticed my distraction during archery practice. "Are you still freaked out about yesterday?" she asked as we retrieved arrows from the target. "Mr. Harmon said it was just underwater currents." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired. Didn't sleep well." "Is it Josephine?" "She's been glued to your side since yesterday." Samantha lowered her voice. "The twins told me she comes here every summer but never makes friends. They think she's obsessed with that drowning story because she's related to the girl who died." "She told me," I admitted. "Andrea was her aunt." Samantha's eyes widened. "Seriously? That's morbid? Why would her parents keep sending her to the camp where her aunt died?" It was a good question, one I hadn't considered. Maybe they don't know she's investigating what happened. Investigating? What are you talking about? I realized I'd said too much and quickly backpedaled. Nothing, just that she's curious about it. Samantha studied my face for a moment, then shook her head. "Whatever she's dragged you into, be careful. The counselors already watch her like a hawk. You don't want that kind of attention." Her warning stayed with me throughout the day. I noticed for the first time how the counselors did indeed seem to track Josephine's movements more closely than the other campers. During swimming, Iris remained unnervingly close to her in the water. At lunch, Maya happened to sit at our table. During free time, there always seemed to be a staff member nearby when Josephine was around. Were they watching her because they knew about her connection to Andrea, or because they feared what she might discover? After dinner, as we walked back to our cabin, I pulled Josephine aside. "We're being watched," I whispered. "The counselors are always around you." "Now you're noticing," she replied with a grim smile. "It's been like this every summer since I started coming here 3 years ago. They know who I am." "Then why do you keep coming back?" Josephine's expression darkened. "Because every year I get closer to the truth. Last summer, I found Andrea's name in an old registry in the main office. It had been crossed out, not just lined through, but violently scribbled over until the page tore." "And your parents just let you come back? After what happened to your aunt?" "They don't know," she admitted. "They think I'm at a science camp in Springfield. My grandmother helps me. She never believed the accident story either." The depths of Josephine's deception stunned me. She had orchestrated an elaborate lie, maintained year after year, all to investigate her aunt's disappearance. Her determination was both admirable and frightening. "What do you think happened to her?" I asked. Josephine glanced around before answering, ensuring no one was within earshot. "I think Ms. Winters was involved. Maybe it was an accident, maybe not. But I know she lied about Andrea being alone that night." "How can you be sure?" "Because I found a photograph in the camp archives last summer. It showed Andrea with Ms. Winters on the dock, time-stamped 11:43 p.m., the night she disappeared." The revelation sent a chill through me. If Josephine was right, the camp director had lied to police and potentially covered up a death, possibly even murder. "The picture disappeared the next day," Josephine continued. "I went back to look at it again, and it was gone. That's when they started watching me more closely." That night, as the cabin settled into sleep, I lay awake, listening for Josephine's signal. Around midnight, I heard 3 soft taps on the wooden post beside my bunk, our agreed-upon code. I slipped out of bed, already dressed in shorts and a t-shirt over my swimsuit as Josephine had instructed. She waited by the door, a small backpack slung over her shoulder. We crept out silently, careful not to wake the others. The camp was eerily quiet. Even the usual chorus of frogs and crickets seemed subdued, as if the wildlife sensed something unnatural about this place. We moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the security lights that illuminated the main paths. The boathouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. Unlike the rest of the camp buildings, it extended partly over the water, built on thick wooden pillars sunk deep into the lake bed. During the day, it was a hub of activity. At night, it transformed into something foreboding. "There's a side door that's never locked," Josephine whispered as we approached. "The caretaker is forgetful." Sure enough, the small maintenance entrance swung open with minimal creaking when she pushed it. We slipped inside, closing it carefully behind us. The interior was pitch black. Josephine switched on a small flashlight, keeping its beam pointed downward to minimize the chance of being spotted from outside. The weak light revealed rows of canoes and kayaks hanging from the ceiling, creating strange, elongated shadows on the walls. "The office is this way," she murmured, leading me past equipment racks toward a small room at the back. The office was little more than a closet with a desk and filing cabinet. Josephine handed me the flashlight and began rifling through the drawers with practiced efficiency. "What exactly are we looking for?" I asked, nervously scanning the boathouse for any sign of movement. "Incident reports, logbooks from 1996, anything about Andrea." She pulled out a dusty ledger. "Hold the light steady." As she flipped through the yellowed pages, I noticed something unusual. Water was seeping under the door, not from the direction of the lake, but from the main boathouse area we just passed through. "Josephine," I whispered urgently, "there's water coming in." She glanced down, frowning at the thin line of moisture advancing across the floor. "That's not possible. The boathouse is watertight." We both stared as the water continued to spread, soaking into the thin carpet. It didn't behave like normal water. It moved with purpose, seeming to reach toward us rather than simply flowing downhill. "We need to leave," I said, backing away until I hit the desk. "Now." Josephine shoved the ledger into her backpack. "Not yet. I found something." She pointed to an entry dated July 17, 1996. "Look." The page detailed a water safety incident involving Camper AW and Counselor CW. It was vague, mentioning only that both had been out after curfew and that appropriate disciplinary measures were implemented. "CW," I read aloud. "Catherine Winters?" Josephine nodded grimly. "This proves they were together that night. But there's something strange about this entry. It's dated July 17th, but my mother always said Andrea disappeared on July 15th. Before I could process this discrepancy, a loud splash came from the main area of the boathouse, not the gentle lapping of the lake against the pillars, but the distinctive sound of something large emerging from water. We froze, eyes locked on the door as water continued to seep underneath, now nearly an inch deep in the small office. "Someone's out there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Not someone," Josephine corrected, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Something." A heavy, wet sound, like sodden footsteps, moved across the boathouse floor, approaching the office. The doorknob turned slowly, metal grinding against metal. Josephine reacted first, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward a small window on the back wall. "Out, now!" She pushed the window open and helped boost me through. I tumbled onto the narrow maintenance walkway that ran along the boathouse exterior, just a few feet above the water. Josephine followed seconds later, pulling the window closed behind her. "Run!" she hissed, pointing toward the shore. We sprinted along the walkway, our footsteps thundering on the wooden planks. Behind us, the window shattered outward, glass tinkling into the lake. Something dark and glistening pushed through the opening, an arm, impossibly elongated and dripping with lake water. The walkway ended abruptly at a small platform. Below us was the lake, black and forbidding in the starlight. To our right, a short jump away, was the main dock that led back to shore. "We have to jump to the dock," Josephine said, already positioning herself for the leap. "On 3, 1, 2. She never reached 3. From beneath the walkway, something surged upward, splintering the wood beneath our feet. I fell backward, narrowly avoiding the grasping fingers that punched through the planks. Josephine wasn't as lucky. A pale hand, bloated and inhuman, clamped around her ankle. She screamed, a sound quickly cut short as she was yanked downward with impossible strength. The walkway collapsed further, and Josephine disappeared into the black water with barely a splash. "Josephine!" I screamed, scrambling to the edge of the broken platform. The lake's surface was already smooth again, as if nothing had disturbed it. Without thinking, I dove in. The water was shockingly warm, almost body temperature. Beneath the surface, I opened my eyes, expecting the sting of lake water. Instead, I could see with unnatural clarity in what should have been total darkness. Josephine was being pulled downward, her struggles growing weaker as she descended. Above her, or rather around her, was a figure so horrifying my mind initially refused to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a girl or even a human as I'd expected. The thing dragging Josephine into the depths was a nightmarish amalgamation of disparate parts, limbs of different sizes fused together around a central mass, multiple faces partially merged into one another. I recognized the face I'd seen beneath my canoe among them, but it was just one of many. With a surge of desperate strength, I swam deeper, reaching for Josephine's outstretched hand. Our fingers touched, then clasped. I pulled with all my might, kicking toward the surface. The thing, I couldn't think of it as Andrea anymore, tightened its grip on Josephine's leg. A sound vibrated through the water, not quite a voice, but communicating unmistakable rage. More limbs extended from the central mass, reaching for me. My lungs burned for air. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. In a final, desperate effort, I yanked Josephine upward, simultaneously kicking at the grotesque appendage that held her. To my shock, the limb broke off, dissolving into the water like ink. The creature recoiled, its many faces contorting in silent screams. With the last of my strength, I pulled Josephine toward the surface. We broke through together, gasping and choking. The dock was just a few yards away. I dragged her toward it, heaving her onto the wooden planks before hauling myself up beside her. What was that thing?" Josephine sputtered between coughs. Before I could answer, lights flared across the camp. Shouts echoed as counselors and staff emerged from their cabins, alerted by our screams. "It wasn't Andrea," I managed, my voice raw. "It was everyone. Everyone who's gone into that lake and never come back." Understanding dawned in Josephine's eyes, followed by horror. "It's collecting them," she whispered. "All this time we thought it was just Andrea, but it's been—" "What in God's name are you two doing?" Ms. Winter's voice cut through the night as she strode down the dock, flanked by two counselors. Her face, illuminated by the flashlight she carried, was twisted with an emotion that went beyond anger. It was fear. "We know what's in the lake," Josephine said, struggling to her feet. "We know what happened to Andrea. What's been happening for years." Ms. Winters went very still. "Take these two to the infirmary," she instructed the counselors. "They're in shock, hypothermia, most likely." "We're telling everyone," I threatened, finding courage in the aftermath of terror. "About the records, about what's really in the lake." "No one will believe you," Ms. Winters replied coldly. "Two hysterical girls who broke curfew to go swimming? You'll be sent home for endangering yourselves, nothing more." As the counselors led us away, I glanced back at the lake. Its surface was perfectly still once more, but I knew now what lurked beneath. Not a ghost, not a drowned girl seeking revenge, but something far worse. Something that had been feeding on the camp's secrets for decades, and Ms. Winters knew all about it. The infirmary was a small building near the main lodge, equipped with basic medical supplies and 4 narrow beds. The camp nurse, Mrs. Bennett, checked us over with clinical efficiency, clucking her tongue at our soaked clothes and scraped limbs. "Hypothermia risk, possible shock," she muttered, wrapping thermal blankets around our shoulders. "What possessed you girls to go swimming at this hour?" Neither Josephine nor I answered. We sat side by side on one of the beds, shivering despite the warmth of the room. It wasn't cold that made us tremble, but the memory of what we'd seen in the lake's depths. Ms. Winters entered after a brief conversation with the counselors outside. Her face was composed now, the fear I'd seen earlier carefully masked behind a professional demeanor. "Mrs. Bennett, would you give us a moment?" she asked. "I need to speak with the girls about the seriousness of their actions." The nurse hesitated, glancing between us and the camp director. "They should rest." "It won't take long," Ms. Winters insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Once we were alone, Ms. Winters closed the blinds on the infirmary windows and turned to face us. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, I noticed details about her I hadn't before. The unnatural tightness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her left hand, the way her skin seemed oddly textured in places, almost scale-like. 23 years, she began, her voice eerily calm. "I've kept this camp running for 23 years since that night. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "We know what's in the lake," Josephine replied, her voice stronger than I expected. "We know about Andrea and the others." Ms. Winters laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. "You know nothing. You saw something you can't possibly understand, and now you think you know the truth. Then tell us, I challenged. Tell us what really happened to Andrea Walsh. The camp director studied us for a long moment, as if weighing her options. Finally, she pulled up a chair and sat facing us, her posture rigid. Andrea was special, she began. Different from the other girls, she sensed things, knew things she shouldn't have known. Like you. She nodded toward me. From the moment you arrived, I knew you would be trouble. You have the same sensitivity. What does that mean? I asked, unnerved by the comparison. It means the lake called to her, just as it's been calling to you. Ms. Winters leaned forward. This isn't an ordinary lake. The Native Americans who lived here called it the Devouring Water. They believed it was a gateway to another place, not heaven or hell, but somewhere in between. Josephine gripped my hand tightly. What happened that night? The records show you were with her. Ms. Winters' expression darkened. Andrea had been sleepwalking toward the lake for days. I started staying up watching her cabin. That night I followed her to the dock. She was standing at the edge, staring into the water as if she could see something beneath the surface. She paused, her gaze distant with memory. I tried to take her back to her cabin, but she fought me, said they were calling her, that she had to join them. I didn't understand what she meant until the water began to move. Move how? I prompted when she fell silent. It rose up, Ms. Winters whispered. Not like a wave, like it was reaching for her. I grabbed her arm, tried to pull her back, but the water, it took her. Pulled her in so fast I barely saw it happen. I dove in after her, but she was just gone. The account aligned with what Josephine had told me about her aunt being an excellent swimmer. If she had been pulled under as suddenly as Ms. Winters described, she would have had no chance to save herself. Why didn't you tell the truth? Josephine demanded. My family has spent 23 years not knowing what really happened to her. Because I did tell the truth at first, Ms. Winters snapped. To the police, to the camp owners. They thought I was insane. Decided I must have been negligent. Allowed a camper to drown on my watch. I was nearly charged with criminal negligence. She stood abruptly, pacing the small room. Then the investigators started disappearing. 2 divers went into the lake to search for Andrea's body. Only one came back up, raving about hands in the darkness. He killed himself 3 days later. My skin crawled at the implication. The thing in the lake, it's been there all along. It's been growing, Ms. Winters corrected. Every person it takes becomes part of it. Andrea was just one of many over the centuries. But after her, it became more active, hungry. So you've been feeding it, Josephine said, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. All these years, girls have been having accidents in the lake, becoming part of whatever that thing is. Ms. Winters' face contorted with genuine outrage. I've been protecting them, keeping them away from the deep water, establishing safety protocols, but some always slip through, the ones it calls to, like Andrea, like you. She pointed at me. You recognized me, I realized. The first day, you knew I could sense it. You have the look, she confirmed. The same one Andrea had. That's why I assigned Iris to watch you closely. Why keep the camp open at all? I asked. If you know what's in the lake, why not shut this place down? Ms. Winters laughed again, that same hollow sound. You think I haven't tried? The first year after Andrea, I recommended closure. The owners refused, too much money invested. When I threatened to go public, I found I couldn't leave. Couldn't leave? Josephine repeated. Ms. Winters rolled up her sleeve slowly, revealing her forearm. In the fluorescent light, the skin appeared mottled, with an almost translucent quality. Beneath the surface, something dark moved, like shadows flowing through water. It marked me that night when I tried to save her, she said quietly. A piece of it, inside me. I can't go beyond the camp boundaries now. Believe me, I've tried. Horror washed over me as I realized the implications. Ms. Winters wasn't just a witness or a conspirator. She was a victim herself, partially claimed by the entity in the lake. So you've been trapped here for 23 years, I said, watching it take more victims. Fewer than you might think, she countered. 3 in all that time. I've gotten better at recognizing the ones it wants, keeping them safe. Until now, Josephine said. It wants her. She nodded toward me. Ms. Winters didn't deny it. It's been more active since you arrived. Agitated. The water temperature has risen 2 degrees in 5 days. That only happens when it's preparing to feed. The clinical way she discussed my potential death chilled me more than the entity itself. What do we do now? You go home, Ms. Winters said firmly. Both of you. First thing tomorrow. I'll tell your parents there was an incident, that you broke curfew and endangered yourselves. It's even true. And then what? Josephine demanded. The camp stays open? That thing keeps growing, taking more girls every few years? My aunt remains part of that abomination? There's nothing to be done about it, Ms. Winters insisted. Nothing human can harm it. Trust me, I've spent 2 decades trying to find a way. There has to be something, I said. Some way to destroy it or contain it. Winters studied me with a mixture of pity and resignation. The indigenous people who lived here believed it could only be appeased through sacrifice. That's why they abandoned this area centuries ago. Too many of their children went missing. We're not sacrificing anyone, Josephine stated flatly. No, Ms. Winters agreed, which is why you're both leaving tomorrow, and why neither of you will speak of this again to anyone. Or what? I challenged. Ms. Winters leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. Or I can't protect you. Not from the thing in the lake and not from what would happen if the truth got out. The camp would close, yes. But I'm not the only one marked by it. There are others, people in positions of authority who've helped keep this quiet over the years, people who've made their own arrangements with what lives in those waters. The implication was clear. This conspiracy extended beyond the camp, perhaps to local officials or others who had encountered the entity and been changed by it, as Ms. Winters had been. Get some rest, she said, rising to leave. Your parents will be called first thing in the morning. After she left, Josephine and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. We can't just leave, she finally said, not knowing what we know now. What choice do we have? I asked. You heard her. That thing is beyond our ability to fight. Josephine's expression hardened with determination. Andrea is in there. Part of her, anyway. I can't leave her like that. And if we do nothing, more girls will be taken. What are you suggesting? She reached into her still damp backpack and pulled out the ledger we'd stolen from the boathouse. There might be something in here. Records of other incidents, maybe information about the lake's history that could help us understand what we're dealing with. We spent the next hour poring over the water-damaged pages, searching for any clue that might help us confront the entity. Most entries were mundane, equipment maintenance, weather conditions, scheduling notes, but scattered throughout were cryptic references to containment protocols and boundary maintenance. Look at this, Josephine said, pointing to an entry from 1998. Annual reinforcement of ward stones completed. Perimeter secure for another season. Ward stones, I repeated. That sounds like someone's been keeping that thing contained in the lake, Josephine finished. All this time, there's been something holding it back, preventing it from extending its reach beyond the water. Further entries confirmed our theory. Every spring before camp opened, Mr. Harmon and Ms. Winters performed some kind of ritual around the lake's perimeter, placing or reinforcing ward stones at key locations. That's why it can pull people in but can't come out itself, I realized. These stones form a barrier. A barrier that's weakening, Josephine added grimly, pointing to more recent entries noting deterioration at the northwest marker and increasing pressure on the southern boundary. The most recent entry, dated just 3 weeks earlier, was particularly disturbing. Containment failing. Estimate complete breach within 1 season if reinforcement impossible. Alternative measures may be necessary. Alternative measures, I echoed. What does that mean? Josephine closed the ledger, her expression grim. I think Ms. Winters has been planning something desperate. A thought occurred to me then, so terrible I almost couldn't voice it. What if that's why you're here? Why your parents suddenly allowed you to come to the camp where your aunt died? What are you saying? Ms. Winters said the indigenous people believed the entity could be appeased through sacrifice. What if she's been guiding certain girls here, girls connected to previous victims? The color drained from Josephine's face. You think she brought me here as a potential sacrifice, to appease that thing? Or to save everyone else, I said quietly, if the containment is failing, and she's tried everything else. Before Josephine could respond, the infirmary door opened. Mrs. Bennet returned, looking tired but professional. You girls should try to sleep. We've called your parents, but they won't be able to pick you up until morning. We exchanged a look, silently agreeing to continue our discussion later. As Mrs. Bennet checked our temperatures and blood pressure one final time, I noticed something I'd missed before, a small tattoo on her wrist, partially hidden by her watch. It appeared to be a symbol. Concentric circles with lines radiating outward, like a stylized sun or star. The same symbol I'd seen etched into the dock pillars and on stones around the lake's edge. The nurse caught me staring and quickly pulled her sleeve down. Try to rest, she said, her tone suddenly cooler. You've had quite a shock. After she left, I whispered to Josephine. She has the symbol. The ward symbol. They're all in on it, Josephine whispered back. The whole staff must be involved in containing that thing. Or serving it, I suggested darkly. We fell into uneasy silence, both pretending to sleep while our minds raced with the horrifying implications of what we'd discovered. Outside, the night grew deeper, and somewhere beyond the infirmary walls the lake waited, patient, hungry, and increasingly unbound. Dawn arrived with a tentative knock on the infirmary door. Iris entered carrying fresh clothes for both of us. Her usually cheerful demeanor was subdued, her movements stiff as she placed the clothes at the foot of our beds. Your parents have been called, she informed us, avoiding eye contact. They'll arrive around noon. Ms. Winters would like to speak with you both after breakfast. We know about the ward stones, I said bluntly, watching for her reaction. Iris froze momentarily, then continued smoothing out the clothes as if I hadn't spoken. Breakfast is in 20 minutes. I'll come back to escort you. Is that why you're all here? Josephine pressed. To maintain the containment, to feed it when necessary. Iris finally looked at us, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Neither of you do. She lowered her voice. Just go home. Forget about this place. Forget what you saw. Like you've forgotten the girls it's taken, I challenged. Something flashed in Iris's eyes, anger, or perhaps guilt. We remember everyone, she said quietly. Their names are carved on the stones that keep that thing from spreading beyond the lake. Their sacrifice protects countless others. This confirmation of our worst suspicions left us momentarily speechless. Iris used our silence to retreat, pausing at the door. 20 minutes. Be ready. After she left, Josephine and I dressed quickly, both processing what we'd learned. We need to see those stones, Josephine said, as she pulled on the camp-issued sweatshirt. The complete circle of them. Maybe there's a way to strengthen the containment without more sacrifices. Or a way to destroy the entity entirely, I added. If there was, don't you think they would have done it by now? Ms. Winters has been trapped here for 23 years. She's had every reason to find a solution. She had a point. Whatever lived in the lake had resisted all attempts to destroy it for centuries. Even the indigenous people had eventually abandoned the area rather than continue fighting it. Then what do we do? I asked. Josephine zipped her backpack, which still contained the stolen ledger. First, we play along. Let them think we're cooperating. Then, before our parents arrive, we find those ward stones and see for ourselves what we're dealing with. Breakfast was a tense affair. The other campers watched us curiously as we entered the dining hall with Iris. Rumors had clearly spread about our nighttime adventure, though I doubted anyone had guessed the truth. Samantha approached our table, concern evident on her face. Are you okay? Everyone's saying you went swimming in the middle of the night and nearly drowned. We're fine, I assured her, attempting a casual tone. Just did something stupid. Our parents are coming to get us later. Both of you. But camp just started, Samantha protested. Can't you talk to Ms. Winters? Explain it was just a mistake? If only she knew how impossible that was. It's complicated, I said. I'll call you when I get home. Explain everything. Though I had no intention of telling Samantha the truth. Some knowledge was too dangerous, too burdensome. Let her enjoy her summer, unaware of what lurked beneath the placid surface of Evergreen Lake. After breakfast, Iris escorted us to Ms. Winter's office in the main lodge. The camp director sat behind a large oak desk, looking as if she hadn't slept. The strange mottling on her skin seemed more pronounced in the morning light, extending visibly up her neck. "Your parents will be here in a few hours," she began without preamble. "Until then, you'll remain under supervision. No wandering, no talking to other campers about what happened last night." "We know about the ward stones," Josephine said, repeating what we'd told Iris. "We know you've been using them to contain the entity in the lake." Ms. Winter's expression didn't change. "Then you understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't some ghost story or urban legend. What lives in that lake has been there since before European settlers arrived. It's patient, intelligent, and growing stronger." "The ledger mentioned the containment is failing," I said. "What happens when it breaks completely?" Ms. Winters sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of her years and more. "First, the water will rise. The lake will expand beyond its natural boundaries. Then it will begin to spread its influence. Dreams at first, calling to people for miles around. Those who answer the call will walk into the water voluntarily, adding to its mass. Eventually it won't need the water at all. It will be able to extend itself onto land." The horror of this scenario struck us both silent. It wasn't just Camp Evergreen at risk, but potentially the entire region. "How long?" Josephine finally asked. "At the current rate of deterioration, by next summer the containment will fail completely." Ms. Winters leaned forward. "That's why we've been researching alternatives, ways to strengthen the ward stones or other solutions. Sacrifices," I said flatly, "like the indigenous people used to do." Ms. Winters didn't deny it. "Voluntary ones if possible, those already marked by the lake, who carry a piece of it within them, like me." The implication stunned us. "You're planning to sacrifice yourself?" Josephine asked. "I've been preparing for it for years," Ms. Winters confirmed. "Strengthening my connection to the entity, learning its patterns, its weaknesses, such as they are. When the time comes, I'll offer myself willingly. It may buy another decade of containment." "Or it might make it stronger," I countered. "If you're already partially merged with it, your sacrifice could be exactly what it needs to break free completely." Doubt flickered across Ms. Winters' face. "That's a possibility we've considered, but the alternatives are worse." "There has to be another way," Josephine insisted. "Something in the camp's history, or in the indigenous lore about the lake." Ms. Winters was quiet for a moment, studying us both. "There is one account. From the 1800s, when the first European settlers came to this area. A traveling preacher claimed to have confronted the entity and driven it deeper into the lake, weakening it temporarily." "How?" I pressed, desperate for any solution that didn't involve human sacrifice. "The account is fragmented. Something about purification through sacred flame and binding the water with earth and air. Most likely religious symbolism rather than literal instructions." Ms. Winters shook her head. "We've tried everything over the years. Fire, chemicals, even explosives placed strategically around the lake. Nothing affects it." But something in her words had triggered a memory. Mr. Harmon's careful explanation of the lake's unusual hydrology and underground springs. "The springs," I said suddenly, "the underwater currents. That's how it spreads its influence, isn't it? Through the water system beneath the lake." Iris finally looked at us, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Neither of you do." She lowered her voice. "Just go home. Forget about this place. Forget what you saw." "Like you've forgotten the girls it's taken?" I challenged. Something flashed in Iris's eyes, anger, or perhaps guilt. "We remember everyone," she said quietly. "Their names are carved on the stones that keep that thing from spreading beyond the lake. Their sacrifice protects countless others." This confirmation of our worst suspicions left us momentarily speechless. Iris used our silence to retreat, pausing at the door. 20 minutes. Be ready." After she left, Josephine and I dressed quickly, both processing what we'd learned. We need to see those stones, Josephine said, as she pulled on the camp-issued sweatshirt. The complete circle of them. Maybe there's a way to strengthen the containment without more sacrifices. Or a way to destroy the entity entirely, I added. If there was, don't you think they would have done it by now? Ms. Winters has been trapped here for 23 years. She's had every reason to find a solution. She had a point. Whatever lived in the lake had resisted all attempts to destroy it for centuries. Even the indigenous people had eventually abandoned the area rather than continue fighting it. Then what do we do? I asked. Josephine zipped her backpack, which still contained the stolen ledger. First, we play along. Let them think we're cooperating. Then, before our parents arrive, we find those ward stones and see for ourselves what we're dealing with. Breakfast was a tense affair. The other campers watched us curiously as we entered the dining hall with Iris. Rumors had clearly spread about our nighttime adventure, though I doubted anyone had guessed the truth. Samantha approached our table, concern evident on her face. "Are you okay? Everyone's saying you went swimming in the middle of the night and nearly drowned." "We're fine," I assured her, attempting a casual tone. "Just did something stupid. Our parents are coming to get us later." "Both of you? But camp just started," Samantha protested. "Can't you talk to Ms. Winters? Explain it was just a mistake?" If only she knew how impossible that was. "It's complicated," I said. "I'll call you when I get home. Explain everything." Though I had no intention of telling Samantha the truth. Some knowledge was too dangerous, too burdensome. Let her enjoy her summer, unaware of what lurked beneath the placid surface of Evergreen Lake. After breakfast, Iris escorted us to Ms. Winters' office in the main lodge. The camp director sat behind a large oak desk, looking as if she hadn't slept. The strange mottling on her skin seemed more pronounced in the morning light, extending visibly up her neck. "Your parents will be here in a few hours," she began without preamble. "Until then, you'll remain under supervision. No wandering, no talking to other campers about what happened last night." "We know about the ward stones," Josephine said, repeating what we'd told Iris. "We know you've been using them to contain the entity in the lake." Ms. Winters' expression didn't change. "Then you understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't some ghost story or urban legend. What lives in that lake has been there since before European settlers arrived. It's patient, intelligent, and growing stronger." "The ledger mentioned the containment is failing," I said. "What happens when it breaks completely?" Ms. Winters sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of her years and more. "First, the water will rise. The lake will expand beyond its natural boundaries. Then it will begin to spread its influence. Dreams at first, calling to people for miles around. Those who answer the call will walk into the water voluntarily, adding to its mass. Eventually it won't need the water at all. It will be able to extend itself onto land." The horror of this scenario struck us both silent. It wasn't just Camp Evergreen at risk, but potentially the entire region. "How long?" Josephine finally asked. "At the current rate of deterioration, by next summer the containment will fail completely." Ms. Winters leaned forward. "That's why we've been researching alternatives, ways to strengthen the ward stones or other solutions. Sacrifices," I said flatly, "like the indigenous people used to do." Ms. Winters didn't deny it. "Voluntary ones if possible, those already marked by the lake, who carry a piece of it within them, like me." The implication stunned us. "You're planning to sacrifice yourself?" Josephine asked. "I've been preparing for it for years," Ms. Winters confirmed, "strengthening my connection to the entity, learning its patterns, its weaknesses, such as they are. When the time comes, I'll offer myself willingly. It may buy another decade of containment." "Or it might make it stronger," I countered. "If you're already partially merged with it, your sacrifice could be exactly what it needs to break free completely." Doubt flickered across Ms. Winters' face. "That's a possibility we've considered, but the alternatives are worse." "There has to be another way," Josephine insisted. "Something in the camp's history, or in the indigenous lore about the lake." Ms. Winters was quiet for a moment, studying us both. "There is one account. From the 1800s, when the first European settlers came to this area. A traveling preacher claimed to have confronted the entity and driven it deeper into the lake, weakening it temporarily. How? I pressed, desperate for any solution that didn't involve human sacrifice. The account is fragmented. Something about purification through sacred flame and binding the water with earth and air. Most likely religious symbolism rather than literal instructions. Ms. Winters shook her head. We've tried everything over the years. Fire, chemicals, even explosives placed strategically around the lake. Nothing affects it. But something in her words had triggered a memory. Mr. Harmon's careful explanation of the lake's unusual hydrology and underground springs. The springs, I said suddenly, the underwater currents, that's how it spreads its influence, isn't it? Through the water system beneath the lake. Ms. Winters looked surprised at my insight. Yes. The entity isn't confined to the lake itself. It extends through the underground water table. The ward stones create a perimeter that prevents it from expanding further, but they don't affect the deep connections. So to truly contain it, you'd need to cut off those underground connections, Josephine reasoned. Seal the springs somehow. Precisely what we've been unable to do, Ms. Winters confirmed. We've consulted geologists, hydrologists, discreetly, of course. The spring system is too extensive, too deep. We'd need to essentially restructure the entire lakebed. An idea was forming in my mind, an impossible, dangerous idea that nonetheless felt right. What if you didn't need to seal every spring? What if you just needed to change what flows through them? Both Josephine and Ms. Winters looked at me questioningly. The entity is water-based, I continued, thinking aloud. Everything we've seen suggests it needs water to maintain its form and influence. What if we introduce something into the spring system that would make the water inhospitable to it? We've tried chemicals, Ms. Winters reminded me. Industrial-strength compounds that would have killed any natural organism. The entity simply absorbed them, incorporated them into itself. Not chemicals, I said. Something elemental. Something natural that opposes water. Understanding dawned on Josephine's face. Fire. Not literal flames, but its essence. Heat. The geothermal vents, Ms. Winters breathed, her eyes widening. There's a dormant geothermal system beneath this region. It's why the lake never freezes, even in the deepest winter. If those vents could be activated somehow, I suggested, the increased heat might drive the entity back, weaken it enough that the ward stones could fully contain it again. Ms. Winters was already moving, pulling old maps and geological surveys from a cabinet behind her desk. The original camp builders considered using the geothermal energy for heating, but abandoned the idea as too costly. The surveys should still be here. She spread several yellowed documents across her desk. We gathered around, examining diagrams of the lake and the surrounding geological features. One map, dated 1962, showed the network of springs feeding into the lake, with several larger ones marked in red. These are the main intake points, Ms. Winters explained, pointing to the red markings. If we could introduce enough heat here, here, and here, it might create a natural barrier. How do we activate dormant geothermal vents? Josephine asked, the practical question bringing us back to reality. Ms. Winters straightened, a new determination in her bearing. There are methods, drilling, hydraulic stimulation, but they require specialized equipment, expertise. And time, I added, which we don't have. Our parents will be here in a few hours. Leave that to me, Ms. Winters said with surprising resolve. I can delay them, create some excuse about road closures or administrative procedures. Josephine looked skeptical. Why are you suddenly willing to help us? You were ready to send us home and continue with your sacrifice plan. Ms. Winters' expression softened slightly. Because in 23 years, you're the first to suggest something we haven't tried. Something that addresses the root of the problem rather than just containing its symptoms. She moved to her desk phone and dialed a number. Mr. Harmon, meet me in my office immediately and bring the old geological equipment from Storage Shed 3. After hanging up, she turned back to us. If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. The entity will sense what we're attempting. It will try to stop us. How? I asked, suddenly fearful. It's confined to the lake. Its physical form is, Ms. Winters corrected, but its influence extends further. It can affect weather patterns near the lake, manipulate local wildlife, and, she hesitated, work through those it has marked. She rolled up her sleeve again, revealing the mottled skin beneath. Like me, part of me belongs to it already. If it senses a true threat, it might be able to override my resistance. Then we need help, Josephine declared. People who haven't been marked, who can continue if you're compromised. Ms. Winters nodded reluctantly. Mr. Harmon has remained relatively unaffected. He never enters the water. And there's Mrs. Bennett. She joined us only 2 years ago, primarily to help research potential solutions. What about Iris and the other counselors? I asked. To varying degrees, all the long-term staff have been influenced. It's unavoidable when you spend years near the lake. But some have developed more resistance than others. The door opened, and Mr. Harmon entered, carrying a large metal case. His weathered face registered surprise at seeing us, then understanding as he took in the maps spread across the desk. You're going to attempt stimulation, he stated, rather than asked. Ms. Winters nodded. These two have provided insight we've been missing. We need to target the main springs, introduce enough heat to drive the entity back and weaken its hold. Mr. Harmon set down the case and opened it, revealing an array of sophisticated equipment, drilling attachments, measuring devices, and what appeared to be small explosive charges. These were left by the Geological Survey team in the 70s, he explained, noticing my alarmed expression. Controlled charges designed to open blocked thermal vents. We considered using them years ago, but couldn't determine the correct placement points. The ward stones, Josephine said suddenly. They must be positioned at key points around the lake, places where the entity's influence is strongest. Ms. Winters looked impressed. Yes, they correspond to the mainspring outlets. Then that's where we place the charges, I concluded. Not to destroy the ward stones, but to use their positions as guides for accessing the underground system. As Mr. Harmon and Ms. Winters began discussing technical details, I felt a strange sensation, a pressure behind my eyes, accompanied by a faint humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. From Josephine's pained expression, I could tell she felt it too. It knows, I whispered to her. It's aware of what we're planning. Outside, the weather was changing rapidly. The clear morning sky had darkened with ominous clouds that seemed to gather directly over the lake. A wind had risen, bending the trees along the shoreline. We need to move quickly, Ms. Winters announced, gathering the maps. Mr. Harmon, assemble a team. Mrs. Bennett, Iris if you think she's strong enough, and Max from maintenance. Tell them only what they absolutely need to know. What about us? Josephine asked. Ms. Winters hesitated. You should remain here, where it's safer. No, I said firmly. We discovered this solution. We're seeing it through. And Andrea was my aunt, Josephine added. I have a right to be there if there's any chance of freeing her from that thing. After a moment's consideration, Ms. Winters nodded. Very well. But you follow instructions precisely. No heroics, no deviations from the plan. Understood? We both agreed, though I wondered if any plan could truly prepare us for confronting the entity again. As we exited the office, the wind outside had strengthened to a gale, and distant thunder rolled across the sky. The lake, visible through the lodge windows, was no longer still. Its surface roiled with waves that seemed to move against the wind, as if something enormous was stirring in its depths. The storm intensified as our small group made its way toward the lake. Wind whipped through the trees, sending branches crashing to the ground around us. The sky had darkened to an unnatural shade of green-black, and lightning flashed directly over the water with increasing frequency. It's fighting back, Ms. Winters shouted over the wind. The entity controls the local weather patterns when threatened. Our group consisted of 7 people, Ms. Winters, Mr. Harmon, Mrs. Bennett, Max, a burly maintenance worker, Iris, Josephine, and myself. We carried equipment distributed among waterproof backpacks, drilling attachments, the small explosive charges, and various measuring devices. Mr. Harmon led us not to the main dock, but to a less-used trail that circled the lake. We need to access all 12 ward stones, he explained. They form a complete perimeter around the water. The first stone was located in a small clearing about 50 yards from the shore. It appeared unremarkable at first glance, just a rough boulder about waist-high. But as we approached, I could see the elaborate symbols carved into its surface, concentric circles, radiating lines, and strange angular glyphs that seemed to shift when viewed directly. More striking was the name carved at the stone's base. Andrea Walsh. Josephine stopped abruptly upon seeing it. "You used her name," she said to Ms. Winters, accusation in her voice. "You bound her to this place even after death." "Not my choice," Ms. Winters replied grimly. "The stones draw power from connection. Names have power, especially the names of those the entity has claimed. They help maintain the barrier." Mr. Harmon had already begun setting up equipment, unfazed by the increasingly violent weather. He attached a narrow drill bit to a portable motor and began carefully boring into the ground beside the stone. "The ward stones are positioned directly above the main spring outlets," Ms. Winters explained as we watched. "We need to create access points approximately 15 feet deep to reach the water channels." The drill made surprisingly quick progress through the soil and underlying rock. Once it reached the desired depth, Mr. Harmon withdrew it and prepared one of the small cylindrical charges. "These are designed for geological work," he assured us, noting our nervous expressions. "Highly directed, minimal collateral impact. They'll create fissures that allow the deeper geothermal heat to rise into the spring channels." As he lowered the charge into the hole, a horrific screeching sound cut through the storm's noise. It came from the lake, a sound no natural creature could make, like metal tearing combined with 1,000 voices crying out in unison. The water began to rise visibly, swelling toward the shore in defiance of natural tides or wind patterns. A thick mist formed above its surface, rapidly spreading toward us. "It's extending itself," Ms. Winters warned. "Everyone stay back from the water's edge." Mr. Harmon finished setting the first charge and activated its timer. 10 minutes, he announced. "We need to move quickly to the next position." We hurried along the trail to the second ward stone, fighting against wind that seemed deliberately intent on pushing us toward the encroaching water. The mist had reached the shoreline now, advancing through the trees like seeking tendrils. The second stone bore another name, Eleanor Price, 2007. One of the 3 victims Ms. Winters had mentioned from her 23 years at the camp. Mr. Harmon repeated the drilling process while Max and Mrs. Bennett kept watch on the approaching mist. "If it touches you, don't panic," Ms. Winters instructed. "It's attempting to establish connection, to access your thoughts. Focus on something concrete, a memory, a name, a simple counting pattern. Don't let your mind wander." As if summoned by her warning, the mist surged forward suddenly, enveloping our group before we could retreat. It was warm and thick, clinging to skin and clothes with unnatural persistence. And within it I heard voices, whispers at first, then clearer communications. "Join us. Be part of something greater. No more pain. No more fear. Only belonging." The voices were seductive, promising peace and acceptance. I found myself taking an involuntary step toward the lake, drawn by their hypnotic quality. "Focus!" Ms. Winters shouted, her voice seeming to come from a great distance. "Ground yourselves!" With tremendous effort, I pulled my thoughts back, concentrating on a simple multiplication table. 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. Anything to drown out the enticing whispers. Not everyone was successful. Iris had begun walking steadily toward the water, her eyes glazed and unfocused. Max lunged forward, grabbing her arm and physically restraining her. "Finished," Mr. Harmon announced, activating the second charge. "Next location, quickly." We moved as a group, supporting those who struggled against the entity's influence. The mist followed, thickening around us. Through breaks in the fog, I could see the lake water had risen several feet, now lapping at areas of the camp that should have been well above the shoreline. The third ward stone bore the name Maria Gonzalez, 2013. The fourth, Samuel Winters. Josephine noticed the last name immediately. "A relative?" she asked Miss Winters. "My husband," the camp director replied, her voice hollow. "He came looking for me after I couldn't leave. The entity took him instead." This revelation cast Ms. Winters' decades-long vigil in a new light. She hadn't just been trapped here by the mark on her skin. She'd been bound by grief and guilt as well. By the sixth stone, the first charge detonated. The ground shook beneath our feet, and from the direction of the first ward stone, a plume of steam erupted. A moment later, an unearthly howl rose from the lake, the entity's response to the first successful geothermal breach. "It's working," Mrs. Bennett confirmed, checking readings on a thermometer-like device. Water temperature at the first spring is rising rapidly. The entity's reaction was immediate and violent. The mist around us congealed, becoming almost solid in consistency. It pressed against us from all sides, seeking entry through every available opening. Nostrils, mouths, even the pores of our skin. Ms. Winters suddenly collapsed, convulsing on the ground. Her skin rippled as if something moved beneath it, and when she opened her eyes, they were completely black. "You cannot stop what has always been," she said, her voice overlaid with countless others speaking in unison. "This vessel has served us faithfully. Now all of you will join the collective." Mr. Harmon reacted without hesitation, dragging Ms. Winters away from the equipment as she thrashed and clawed at him. "Continue the work," he shouted to Max and Mrs. Bennett. "Complete the circle." The second charge detonated, then the third in quick succession. Each blast sent more steam rising from the ground, and with each release the entity's howls grew more desperate. We pushed forward through the mist, completing the preparations at each wardstone. My lungs burned from the effort of filtering the thick air, and my skin crawled with the sensation of countless invisible fingers probing for weakness. Josephine stayed close beside me, her face set in grim determination. "3 more," she encouraged as we reached the 10th stone. "We're almost there." The lake had risen to unprecedented levels, flooding much of the camp. From our elevated position on the trail, we could see cabins partially submerged, the main dock completely underwater. The entity was throwing its full might against us, using the very element it controlled as a weapon. As Max finished drilling at the 11th stone, a massive surge of water burst from the lake, forming into a towering column that defied physics and gravity. At its center was a shape, a grotesque amalgamation of human features, partially formed and constantly shifting. Multiple limbs extended from a central mass, and faces pressed outward from within, mouths open in silent screams. Among them, I recognized the face I'd seen beneath my canoe. Young, female, with an expression of eternal torment. Andrea Walsh, or what remained of her. "Andrea!" Josephine cried out, taking an involuntary step toward the apparition. "It's not her." I grabbed Josephine's arm, pulling her back. "Not anymore. It's using her image to manipulate you." The water column surged forward, sweeping across the ground toward us. Mr. Harmon shouted a warning, but too late. The leading edge engulfed Max before he could retreat. We watched in horror as he was lifted off his feet, his body seeming to dissolve into the churning mass. "The charge!" Mrs. Bennett screamed. "It's still in his hand!" Indeed, the final explosive was clutched in Max's partially subsumed fist as the entity absorbed him. If we couldn't retrieve it or activate it, our entire plan would fail at the final step. Without thinking, I lunged forward, reaching into the water column for the charge. The liquid felt alive, clinging to my arm with conscious malevolence. Faces pressed against my skin, Max's among them now, his features already blurring as he was assimilated into the collective. My fingers brushed against the metal cylinder. With a supreme effort, I closed my hand around it and yanked backward. The entity resisted, pulling against me. For a terrible moment, I felt myself being drawn inward, my consciousness beginning to fragment as hundreds of voices crowded into my mind. Then Josephine was beside me, her arms around my waist, pulling with all her strength. Together, we tore free, falling backward onto solid ground with the charge clutched in my burning hand. Mr. Harmon didn't waste a moment. He grabbed the device, rushed to the 11th drilling site, and dropped it in, activating the timer. "Final position," he shouted, already moving toward the 12th wardstone. The entity's water column collapsed, splashing back to the ground but immediately beginning to reform. We ran the final 100 yards to the last stone, which stood atop a small rise overlooking the lake. This stone was different from the others, larger, more elaborately carved, and bearing no single name. Instead, it was covered with dozens of names, dates stretching back centuries. At its base, a small depression had been carved out, lined with metal that gleamed dully in the stormlight. "The master stone," Mrs. Bennett explained as Mr. Harmon began drilling. "The focal point of the entire containment system. The 12 stones form a circle, but this one channels their energy." The 11th charge detonated, and the entity's scream reached a new pitch of rage and pain. The water column had reformed, larger than before, surging toward our position with frightening speed. "It knows what we're doing," Mrs. Bennett said, her voice surprisingly calm. It will throw everything it has at us now. Mr. Harmon finished drilling and prepared to place the final charge. As he reached for the detonator, the ground beneath us trembled violently. A fissure opened between him and the hole, nearly swallowing him before he leaped clear. "I can't reach it," he shouted as the crack widened. The water column was almost upon us, its leading edge morphing into grasping hands and snarling mouths. Within its mass, I could now see not just Andrea and Max, but Ms. Winters as well, her form distorted but recognizable among the countless others. Josephine stepped forward, the final charge in her hand. She had retrieved it when Mr. Harmon dropped it. "I'll do it," she said, determination in every line of her body. "For Andrea." Before anyone could stop her, she leaped across the widening fissure, landing precariously on the other side. The entity surged forward, water crashing around her legs as she knelt by the drill hole. "Josephine!" I screamed, watching in horror as the water began to creep up her body. She looked back at me one last time, a sad smile on her face. "Tell my mother what really happened," she called. "Tell her Andrea wasn't alone." With that, she dropped the charge into the hole and pressed the detonator. The entity's water engulfed her completely, just as the ground beneath the master stone erupted in a geyser of steam and superheated water. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the entity. A chain reaction spread from the master stone to each of the 11 other sites, creating a circle of roaring geysers around the lake. The water column collapsed entirely, unable to maintain cohesion as the temperature rose. From the lake itself came a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, not rage or pain, but something more complex. It reminded me of ice cracking on a frozen pond, multiplied 1,000-fold. The surface of the water began to literally fracture, as if it were a solid mass breaking apart. Steam rose in massive clouds, obscuring our view of the lake and most of the camp. The wind, which had been howling around us, stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the hissing of the geysers and the continuing crack of the lake's surface. When the steam finally cleared enough for us to see, the lake had changed fundamentally. Its water level had dropped dramatically, revealing long submerged features of the lake bed. But more significantly, the water itself had changed. No longer the unnaturally clear, dark blue it had been, but a cloudy, mineral-rich turquoise typical of geothermal pools. Where Josephine had stood, there was no sign remaining. The master stone had cracked down the middle, its elaborate carvings disrupted but still partially legible. Mr. Harmon approached it cautiously, testing the ground with each step. "It worked," he said in disbelief. "The geothermal activation created a natural barrier the entity couldn't overcome, the heat. It forced it deeper, away from its sources of power." "Is it destroyed?" I asked, my voice raw from screaming Josephine's name. Mrs. Bennet shook her head. "Not destroyed. Contained. Perhaps permanently this time." She pointed to the fractured lake surface. "What you're seeing is its physical form breaking apart, losing cohesion. Without access to new material, it can't maintain itself." I understood what she meant by material. People, victims like Andrea and Max, and now Josephine. The thought made me sick with grief and rage. And the others? The people it took? Are they released, I believe, Mrs. Bennet said gently. "Not restored. That would be impossible after assimilation. But freed from the collective consciousness that bound them to the entity." I stared at the transformed lake, wanting to believe her but consumed by the knowledge of Josephine's sacrifice. She had given her life to end this horror, to free her aunt's spirit and prevent more victims. In the days that followed, as authorities tried to make sense of the natural disaster that had struck Camp Evergreen, I maintained the fiction that Josephine and I had simply been caught in a sudden storm and geological event. That Josephine had been swept away by floodwaters. That the strange lights and sounds reported by other campers were lightning and thunder. The camp closed permanently. The official explanation cited geological instability and unexpected thermal activity, rendering the site unsafe. Most of the staff disappeared quietly, moving on to other jobs in distant places. Mr. Harmon remained to oversee the demolition of the remaining structures and implementation of a permanent restricted zone around the lake. I returned home, carrying the truth with me like a physical weight. I kept my promise to Josephine, visiting her mother to explain what had really happened to Andrea and to her daughter. Whether she believed me or not, I couldn't say. But the letter I received months later, thanking me for giving her closure after so many years of uncertainty, suggested that on some level, she accepted the truth. Sometimes in my dreams, I still see Josephine's face in that final moment, not afraid, but resolute. I see Andrea too, and others I never knew, their features gradually separating from the grotesque collective, finding peace as they dissolved not into the entity, but into freedom. The lake remains cordoned off, classified as a geological hazard zone. Satellite images show it has continued to change, becoming smaller and more obviously geothermal in nature. Scientists study it from a distance, puzzled by its rapid transformation but unwilling to approach too closely. They report that the water temperature remains unusually high, that wildlife avoids the area, that instruments malfunction when placed too near the shore. What they don't report, what they can't measure, is the absence. The lake is just a lake now. The weight of malevolence that hung over it for centuries has lifted. The hungry presence that waited in its depths has retreated to some place we can't reach. I know this because I visited once, a year after it happened. Standing at the edge of the restricted zone, I felt nothing calling to me. No whispers, no unsettling awareness of being watched. Just the ordinary sounds of wind through trees and water lapping at a rocky shore. Before leaving, I placed flowers on the fractured master stone, not just for Josephine and Andrea, but for all those whose names were carved into its surface. The victims and the guardians, the sacrificed and the saved. The entity may not be destroyed, may never be truly gone, but it is contained, weakened, pushed back to whatever dark place spawned it. And if someday it begins to rise again, the knowledge of how to fight it remains, in my memories, in the geological records, in the truth I've preserved. Some nightmares can't be defeated entirely, but they can be faced, understood, and ultimately contained. I haven't been swimming since that summer. I probably never will again. Some fears mark you permanently, become part of who you are. But I've learned to live with the memories, to use them as a reminder of both human fragility and strength. Of how much we risk when we ignore the warnings of the past, and how much we can accomplish when we face our deepest fears together.